Hiroshima, Japan, August the 6th, 1945. At 31,000 feet, the crew of a single American bomber watched in silence as the world below them ceased to exist. One of those men would later describe what he saw. The sight that greeted our eyes was quite beyond what we had expected, because we saw this cloud of boiling dust and debris below us, with this tremendous mushroom on top. Beneath that was hidden the ruins of the city of Hiroshima. In a single blinding flash, the age of air power reached its terrible conclusion, and the age of atomic warfare began. But the story of how the world arrived at that moment, how a fragile machine of wood and canvas became the most devastating instrument of destruction ever devised, stretches back decades. It is a story of dreamers and engineers, of terrified young pilots and ice-cold strategists. It is a story told in the thunder of 1,000 bomber engines over Cologne, in the scream of a Stuka diving over Poland, in the quiet hum of a Spitfire climbing through English clouds. It is the story of how air power changed everything. During the Great War, there had been no dramatic increase in aircraft speed. The 90 miles an hour achieved by fighters in 1914 rose to only 125 miles an hour by the fighters of 1917 and 18. Aircraft range, however, was vastly extended. When the Frenchman Louis Blériot flew across the 20 miles of the English Channel in 1909, it was considered an amazing feat. Yet exactly 10 years later, two Englishmen, John Alcock and Arthur Whitten Brown, succeeded in crossing the Atlantic, crash landing on the Irish coast in their converted Vickers-Vimy bomber. In the 1920s, flying became one of the great spectacles. Pilots like the American Charles Lindbergh and the Englishwoman Amy Johnson trailblazed their way around the world. Airlines followed in their wake, dramatically speeding up communications around the globe and bringing its peoples closer together. Aircraft flew ever faster and ever higher. And as they did, military minds began to see possibilities that would reshape the nature of war itself. The creation of strategic bombing forces during 1914 to 18 cast a long shadow. Military strategists came to believe that the bomber could win wars on its own by striking at the very heart of an enemy nation. But the fighters still had an important role to play, gaining and maintaining air superiority over the ground battle. Up until the mid-1930s, the fighter looked little different from those of the Great War. Wooden construction and twin wings made them slow to climb, making it difficult to intercept bombers before they dropped their payloads. But the metal-framed monoplanes were a different story entirely. They were fast enough to catch the bombers, and they were helped enormously by the introduction of radar, which meant that incoming bombers could be tracked well before they approached their targets. In the 1930s, the bombing of Madrid and Guernica during the Spanish Civil War served to convince people that the bomber would dominate future major wars. This was reinforced by Japanese air attacks on Chinese cities like Shanghai in 1937. The greatest fear was that air forces would employ gas bombs, and so, as the prospect of war grew ever more certain, nations began to equip their civilians with gas masks. By 1939, the world had convinced itself of one terrifying proposition: the bomber would always get through. What no one had yet grasped was just how complex, how costly, and how morally agonizing the reality of air warfare would prove to be. The Messerschmitt Me-109 was the German superior fighter when the war began in 1939. It had already proved itself in Spain during the Civil War. The 109 Emile, which entered service that year, was capable of speeds of over 350 miles per hour. One British test pilot who flew a captured 109 at the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough recalled the experience vividly. "We did a comparison trial between this first 109E and a Spitfire Mark II, he said. They were very comparable in their performance, but I thought the 109 going downhill fast was very stiff on controls, much metal strutting and reinforcing around, which restricts your vision very, very much." The German fighter pilots had also developed a highly effective combat formation that gave them a tactical edge in the opening campaigns. The Germans also fielded the twin-engined Me-110, whose role was as a bomber escort. It, too, flew at more than 350 miles per hour, but it lacked the maneuverability of the 109. One Allied pilot was blunt in his assessment. The German thought he was very good. Actually, it was an absolute gift for a single-engine fighter. A German pilot offered a more nuanced view of twin-engine fighters. I don't hold too much from twin engines, because if you get hit in a real combat in one engine and the one engine explodes, then normally the second engine explodes too. During the invasions of Poland and the Low Countries, the Luftwaffe achieved air supremacy by destroying opposing air forces on the ground. While it was never wholly successful in this, its fighters outmatched their often obsolete opponents, and air supremacy was quickly achieved. This did much to ensure the success of the ground offensives. But there was one critical failure, and it came against the British Royal Air Force in 1940. The RAF had two fighters which could match those of the Luftwaffe. The rugged Hawker Hurricane could outmaneuver the Me-110, and the Supermarine Spitfire could certainly keep up with the Me-109 at high speed, although it initially lacked firepower. One pilot who flew both during the war offered this comparison. Without doubt, the Spitfire was the glamour puss of the two airplanes. However, the Hurricane could do many things the Spitfire couldn't. If you had a Hun at the rear end of you, or you wanted to make tight evasive action, without doubt the Hurricane could outturn a Spitfire. As far as the Spitfire was concerned, right from the very word go, it had a very much better rate of climb than the Hawker Hurricane. When the Spitfire got its improved engines, it could go to a much greater height. The Me-109 and the Spitfire were evenly matched in performance. The Spitfire's controls were much quicker at high altitude, and the cockpit a lot less cramped. But the 109 carried only enough fuel for just over 1 hour's flying, which seriously limited its combat time over the English coast, and was a considerable drawback. The British radar stations were also becoming increasingly efficient. This, together with an equally efficient command and control system, often enabled the RAF fighters to gain altitude advantage over their opponents. A German pilot who fought in that battle acknowledged the challenge they faced. The real enemy we met in the Channel, the British, with its Spitfire and Hurricane England, had the best air defense concerning the technology of their aircraft and the training of their pilots, as well as their ground defense systems. That caused us a lot of difficulties, and we experienced enormous losses there. But so did the British. One RAF pilot described the grinding toll of those weeks. I did 16 sorties in 6 days. I started asking myself, how long is this going to go on? Because I'd been at it since May the 10th, with very few days off, and I'd been hit twice. You get to a point where you carry on in desperation. And sometimes it works, you come out of it unscathed, and you've learned something. Another experience. We won't get into that predicament again. The Luftwaffe failed in their attack on the radar system, and consequently suffered. The Battle of Britain was the first great defeat inflicted on Hitler's war machine, and it was won in the air. In 1941, following the immense success of RAF Fighter Command, the British launched cross-channel sweeps in order to draw German fighters into the air. The Germans, now operating close to their bases in northern France, had more fuel available for combat than their opponents. Fighter strength in the West was weakened considerably by Hitler's invasion of Russia in June of that year. But during the second half of 1941, the Germans introduced the formidable Focke-Wulf FW-190, able to attain a speed of well over 400 miles per hour. At low altitude, it could outmaneuver the Spitfire Mark V. A German pilot explained the 190's advantages. The Focke-Wulf had a very strong engine, and in itself was very robust. The Me-109 had a liquid-cooled engine, which meant that if some shrapnel damaged the cooling system, the 109 couldn't continue, whereas the Focke-Wulf, with its air-cooled system, could. But the aircraft had its weaknesses too. The same pilot admitted some of the shortcomings were that when dive bombing, because of the air-cooled system, depending on the speed, it would open up and affect the stability of the airplane. Sometimes the aircraft would tilt to one side, and you could find yourself in a helpless situation. You had no control over it, and it would be very difficult to right again. Early in 1942 came the appearance of the 109 Gustav, which was to become the backbone of the German fighter arm. It performed especially well at high altitudes, which would matter enormously once the U.S. 8th Air Force began its daylight bombing offensive against occupied Europe in earnest. Meanwhile, in the Mediterranean, the air war had taken on a character of its own. In North Africa, obsolete Italian CR-42 biplanes took off to duel with equally dated British Gloucester Gladiators in the very early months of the conflict. It was a strange echo of the Great War biplanes circling and diving in the desert sky. On Malta, Three gladiators, nicknamed Faith, Hope, and Charity, provided the mainstay of the island's air defense during the early months of the siege. Three aircraft, holding the line against everything the Axis could throw at them. It was an act of defiance that became the stuff of legend. On the other side of the world, the Japanese Mitsubishi Zero fighter dominated the Pacific War during the initial conflict. The Western view that Japanese pilots were not as skillful as their adversaries soon proved dangerously wrong. An American pilot recalled his first encounter. "I was just a young fighter pilot and had been with my squadron only a couple of months, but real eager to get out there and have at the Japs. We were fired up to go, and we had one of the rudest shocks of our lives when we first encountered the Zero. We never expected anything like it. It was such a tremendously maneuverable airplane, it was unbelievable. The first time I had one in my sights, I was just ready to punch the pickle, and away went the Zero, right out of my sight." He paused, then added, "The Zero could outmaneuver us solid, but the Zero could not take any punishment. You got a good burst into a Zero, and it would blow right away. So that was our advantage. Yet 1-for-1, it was a bad day to fight a Zero." At the outbreak of war in 1939, the combatant nations laid down very strict guidelines for their bomber forces. They should only attack military targets, but within 3 weeks of the German invasion of Poland, the Luftwaffe was bombing Warsaw. The justification, according to the Germans, was that the Polish capital had made itself a military target by refusing to surrender. The German attack on Rotterdam in May of 1940 was for the same reason, though it could have been avoided if the message to turn the German bombers back had reached them in time. During the Battle of Britain, the main targets for the German bombers were airfields, radar stations, docks, and aircraft factories. And then came one of those pivotal accidents of war. The Blitz on Britain so very nearly did not happen. It was the result of a navigational error by a German bomber, which dropped its bombs on London by mistake. This led to the RAF's immediate retaliation with a raid on Berlin, and with that, the era of city-busting had begun. Even so, at this stage, the bombers of both sides were still instructed to attack specific targets: munitions, factories, shipyards, rail junctions, but they had severe problems achieving accuracy. One veteran recalled the early days of the RAF bombing campaign. The idea was with mass formations. They would carry out raids on the shipbuilding, naval dockyards, Wilhelmshaven, Kiel, Emden, and so forth. But they were disastrous, because the idea was that mass formations would be self-protective. The bombers in those days, the Whitleys, Hamptons, and Wellingtons, had inadequate defenses in their turrets, and they were pounced on by German 109s. "We had some heavy losses of pre-war professional crews. It was the failure of those tactics that caused Bomber Command to take to night bombing," he added, with the bluntness of hard experience. "I was very doubtful, after our experiences, that the bomber would get through in daylight. They had heavier machine guns than we had. We, for some reason or other, always had nothing but 303. Well, it's rather like a pea shooter against an elephant, a 303 against an armored fighter." By September 1940, the Germans had begun night bombing for the same reason. Navigation, reliant on dead reckoning, suffered. Bomb sites were little different from those of 1918 and just as inaccurate. In the summer of 1941, the British commissioned a study into bombing accuracy, and the results were sobering. Only some 10% of bombers were getting their bombs to within 5 miles of their targets in Western Germany. 5 miles. Something had to be done. It was inevitable that civilians would suffer, as the munitions factories were usually in urban areas or close to them. The question was no longer whether civilians would die, it was how many. Both the Luftwaffe and the RAF had possessed only medium bombers at the outbreak of war types like the Heinkel He-111 and the Vickers Wellington, with limited range and payload. The Germans saw no real need for long-range heavy bombers, thinking only of war against neighboring nations. They did reconsider this decision later, but heavy bombers like the Heinkel He-177 never really got beyond the prototype stage. The RAF, too, initially concentrated on medium bombers to match the Luftwaffe numerically. However, specifications for heavy bombers were drawn up by the late 1930s, and these began to come into service during the first half of 1941. But with the spring of 1942 came an aircraft that was to become one of the most outstanding bombers of the war: the Avro Lancaster. Winston Churchill during this time had seen RAF Bomber Command as the only direct way of striking back at Germany, and reducing the pressure on the Russians. With enough heavy bombers, the RAF could destroy the German economy and, its advocates believed, the morale of her people by attacking her cities. There was, however, a problem. Britain's aircraft needs were not confined to bombers. There was an extreme shortage of maritime patrol aircraft in the Atlantic, desperately needed to keep the U-boats at bay. The production of bombers could not be given absolute priority. In February 1942, RAF Bomber Command received a new chief, Arthur Harris, soon to be nicknamed Bomber Harris. He was a very straight-talking man. He believed, and the air staff supported him, that the policy of city-busting or area bombing could bring Germany to her knees. This would achieve final victory without the massive ground force casualties that an invasion would demand. With this conviction burning like a pilot light, Harris launched the 1,000-bomber raids at the end of May 1942. Contemporary newsreel captured the scale of it. 1,000 planes dropping several thousand tons on Cologne in an hour and a half, using some of the heaviest bombs available. For 95 minutes, every 6 seconds a bomb fell on that city. It was not all high-explosive incendiaries in their thousands set devastating fires across the target. The RAF could not maintain this size of raid and would be unable to do so until mid-1944. But a statement had been made. The war was coming home to Germany. The British bombers had to contend with an ever more effective German air defense, a combination of radars, searchlights, anti-aircraft guns, and night fighters were organized in zones covering the approaches to Germany and the major cities. RAF Bomber Command would pay dearly for its attacks because of these defenses. One bomber crew member recalled the terror of the searchlights. One thing we hadn't solved was getting out of searchlights, because they used to put a load of searchlights onto you and do what they called a cone. The problem was to get out of that, because once you were lit up in those days, we were flying about 5,000 or 6,000 feet once you're in there. The gunners on the ground had a target to shoot at, and they used to give you a rather warm time. Another crew member described the night fighter threat. You had to keep your eyes open, because suddenly they come out of the darkness, and you wouldn't know anything until suddenly you've got tracers coming at you. They used to come up from underneath, and that's where lots of aircraft were shot down, because the German fighters had a gun that went straight up. They used to come up underneath the main planes, hit the target, which was the petrol tanks. The whole lot would explode. The losses were staggering. Of every 100 aircrew who embarked on a tour of operations with RAF Bomber Command, 60 would be killed before they had completed the statutory 30 missions. The men who flew these missions carried a burden that statistics alone could never convey. I don't believe anybody who says they weren't frightened at some time or other, one veteran admitted. My principal worry was getting badly hit, so the aircraft burnt. I wasn't too worried about having to get out, if we could get out, but my real worry was either going down in flames, or the wing coming off and then you're really in dead trouble. It was not mere bravery that kept them going. It was something more complicated: duty, stubbornness, and the fierce refusal to let down the men beside them. While the strategic bombers struck at cities and industry, another form of air power was being perfected closer to the ground. The Germans had developed fighter ground attack into a fine art, initially with the Junkers U-87 Stuka dive bomber. The Stuka proved a devastating weapon during the early campaigns, working closely with the panzer formations as aerial artillery. Its siren regularly served to terrify ground troops into panic. The British armed a Hurricane with bombs, calling it a hurry bomber, during the desert campaigns in North Africa. Both the British and the Germans used their ground attack aircraft as tank busters, equipping them with cannon-firing, armor-piercing ammunition. The Hawker Typhoon, a rocket-firing aircraft, was used extensively during the latter half of the war, especially during the 1944-45 campaign in northwest Europe. In the summer of 1941, the Russians introduced their newly developed Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik, which proved a devastatingly effective close-air support aircraft. It was so heavily armored that German pilots struggled to bring it down. As one recalled, you had to aim very actively. A lot of pilots, the whole ammunition was gone, and it was still flying. Air power also transformed the very concept of how troops could be delivered into battle. Development of airborne forces began with the Germans and the Russians in the 1930s. During the invasion of Norway in April 1940, the Germans were the first to use them in action. Their most impressive airborne operation was the invasion of the island of Crete in May 1941, with some 5,000 men being dropped. But the Germans ceased mounting any more such operations on a large scale due to the substantial loss of Juncker's Ju-52 transports. The British and Americans took up where the Germans left off. They began to use airborne forces to spearhead their invasions from November 1942 onwards. The first Allied Airborne Army was formed in the spring of 1944, and their divisions played a major part in the Normandy landings. But perhaps the most ambitious and most tragic airborne operation was Operation Market Garden. The plan was audacious: land troops in front of the ground forces and capture and hold important strategic bridges at Arnhem, Nijmegen, Grave, and in the Eindhoven area. The Germans had flooded large areas of Holland to prevent the movement of ground troops, but they had not bargained for this great airborne assault. And yet, because the ground forces were unable to link up with the British and Polish paratroopers at Arnhem in time, the operation failed. It remains one of the great what-ifs of the war. Harris was by now looking to the Americans, whose 8th Air Force was building up in Britain, to lend weight to the campaign. Its main strength lay in the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress. While it did not carry the bomb load of the RAF's Lancaster, it had far more defensive weapons. One B-17 veteran put it simply: the B-17 was an experimental aircraft as far as World War II is concerned. It would take more punishment. I flew B-29s. They wouldn't take anywhere near the punishment of the B-17. It would bring you home on one engine, 2 engines, whatever, half your tail shot off. It was a great airplane. Another American airman was more specific about the difference in doctrine. The British did not believe that we could bomb in daylight. They tried it. It didn't work. But we had what was known as the Norden bomb sight. We had the tight formation. We had the firepower to do it. And we proved it could be done. We bombed the strategic targets by day. The British bombed towns and cities by night. The 8th Air Force B, 17 seconds, made their operational debut in mid-August 1942. It was to be some months before they were in sufficient strength to launch major attacks against Germany. In the meantime, they gained operational experience over France and the Low Countries. Early results were very impressive in terms of bombing accuracy due to the Norden bomb sight. In January 1943, the Allies agreed on a combined bombing offensive as a necessary step to final victory over Germany. Point Blank was the code name. The RAF continued to attack by night, while the Americans did so by day. This was called round-the-clock bombing. Point Blank was launched by the RAF in March 1943, with the beginning of what became known as the Battle of the Ruhr, the main industrial region in western Germany, lying against the east bank of the River Rhine. The battle lasted 4 months, but the result was inconclusive. Industrial haze and effective German air defenses were the main reasons. But the RAF also underestimated the Germans' recovery rate from these attacks, and made another mistake in ignoring the fact that the British people themselves had remained resilient under the Blitz. They believed that the Germans would crack under the same pressure. They were wrong. Not all of the RAF attacks were of the city-busting sort. Light and medium bombers made attacks by day to cause surprise, many of them at dangerously low levels. The twin-engined de Havilland Mosquito, with its all-wooden airframe, was particularly effective in this role. Its speed and agility made it almost impossible to intercept, and it could deliver its payload with remarkable precision. The attack on the Gestapo jail at Amiens in northern France proved what the Mosquito could accomplish when flown with audacity and skill. British aircraft designer Barnes Wallis was responsible for the RAF's most spectacular raid of the war against the dams in May 1943. Wallis designed a special type of bomb for this mission, as conventional types would not work. The newly designed bomb would bounce on the water and strike horizontally rather than vertically. A special Lancaster squadron was formed for the operation, which took place on the 16th and 17th of May. 2 of the 3 dams attacked were breached, but 8 out of the 19 aircraft involved failed to return. Even so, the attack provided a major boost to RAF Bomber Command's morale. Towards the end of July 1943, Harris targeted the northern German port city of Hamburg, which he was determined to destroy. Bombers of the 8th United States Air Force joined the assault, roaring across the North Sea in broad daylight. Tons of bombs rained from the skies. Aerial photographs showed the results. 7 square miles of Hamburg's war industries, docks, and military installations flattened and in ruins. Water mains, gas, and electric plants destroyed. Hamburg as a war center, as a base for submarines, was virtually wiped off the map. August 1943 was a disastrous month for the American bombers. On the 1st of the month, the 9th Air Force, based in North Africa, launched a low-level attack against the Ploiești oil fields in Romania. The low altitude meant that German radars were unable to spot them on their way to the target, giving the air defenses little or no warning. The bombers reached the oil fields and caused considerable damage. As the campaign continued, its steady pounding whittled away 90% of Romanian oil production. But the return flight was not a success. A third of the 177 B-24 Liberators were lost. Many other bombers were severely damaged. As one veteran said simply, "We hurt them, but they hurt us too." The Ploiești campaign had cost 270 heavy bombers, 49 fighters, and their crews. Each plane and each man helped to shorten the war, but the price was agonizing. Only 2 weeks after Ploiești, the 8th Air Force struck at the Me-109 fighter factory at Regensburg and a ball-bearing factory at Schweinfurt. The losses were devastating. 60 of the 376 bombers involved were shot down, and 170 damaged. No Air Force could continue absorbing such casualties. This led to the temporary withdrawal of the 8th Air Force to less dangerous targets on the fringes. In October 1943, the Americans attacked Schweinfurt again. 60 B-17s failed to return. The Americans were losing confidence in daylight attacks and considered switching to night operations. The main problem was brutally clear. Their bombers, although heavily armed, could not defend themselves deep inside Germany. They had dedicated escort fighters, the P-47 Thunderbolt and the P-38 Lightning, but neither type had the range to accompany the bombers all the way to targets in the German heartland. One veteran reflected on the lessons learned. The concept of hitting them round the clock with daylight and night raids was sound. The problem was that in the early days, we did not have enough bombers and we did not have enough fighters to make deep penetrations into Germany without prohibitive losses. The only thing I could recommend would be to have learned our job a little more slowly and waited a little longer before making the very deep and very damaging penetrations. The answer to this crisis had a name: the P-51 Mustang. Equipped with extra fuel tanks, it began to appear in early 1944, and it changed everything. At last, American fighters could escort their bombers deep into the Reich and back. One P-47 pilot, who also knew the capabilities of his own aircraft, offered this assessment: "We had 8 machine guns in the P-47, which was tremendous firepower compared to the 6 machine guns in the P-51. There was no other fighter in the world with that amount of firepower. It was a sturdy airplane built like a tank, and I could drive it through most anything. It was more than a match for the Focke-Wulf 190, more than a match for the 109. But the P-47, for all its virtues, could not follow the bombers all the way to Berlin. The Mustang could." In the early 1920s, American General Billy Mitchell carried out a series of experiments to demonstrate how effective aircraft could be against ships. The Second World War was to prove Mitchell right beyond anything he might have imagined. The aircraft carrier took over as the Navy's principal weapon from the battleship, transforming the war at sea. But land-based aircraft were just as deadly. The warships themselves were forced to adopt ever stronger anti-aircraft armament in response, and yet aircraft losses remained appallingly high. By the end of 1941, the RAF's anti-shipping squadrons, mainly equipped with the Beaufort torpedo bomber, were suffering a significantly higher casualty rate than any other branch of the service in the Mediterranean. From 1943, the Allies suffered additional shipping losses due to the introduction of Germany's HS-293, a glider bomb that proved extremely effective. The British designed their own anti-shipping weapon, codenamed Highball, which worked on the same principle as the bouncing bomb used in the RAF's famous Dams raid. But Highball was never used in anger. The Royal Navy in the Mediterranean suffered especially from aircraft operating from southern Italy and Sicily in its attempts to keep Malta supplied. During the evacuations of the army from France in 1940 and Crete in 1941, the British lost vast numbers of warships to German air attack. The capital ships Prince of Wales and Repulse were lost to Japanese air attack off the Malayan coast in December of 1941. And the German battleship Tirpitz, which had long been a major threat to the supply convoys to Russia, was finally destroyed by heavy British bombers using the amazing 12,000-pound Tallboy, a unique bomb with its fuse in the tail, enabling it to penetrate the ship's armor before detonating. The Battle of the Atlantic was World War II's longest-running campaign, and aircraft played an ever-increasing role. During the first half of the battle, long-range German Focke-Wulf Condors, operating from western France, ranged far and wide over the Atlantic. They directed U-boats onto convoys and themselves attacked ships with success. Allied aircraft, in turn, could spot a U-boat on the surface and direct warships onto them. One crew member explained the logic. Even if you didn't sink a submarine, so long as you could keep them with their heads down first of all, that reduced their range because they couldn't travel very far. I think they only did about 4 knots underwater, as opposed to, say, 12 knots on the surface. A surface U-boat was extremely vulnerable to air attack, and half of the German submarines sunk during the war fell victim to aircraft. The RAF even developed a searchlight system called the Lee Light, mounted on patrol bombers. One pilot who used it described his aircraft. "The airplane I flew was a Mark 14 Wellington, fitted with a 12 million candle power searchlight called a Lee Light, which was lowered from a sort of dustbin contraption at the back of the bomb bay. That was to illuminate submarines, if you found one." May 1943 saw the turning point in the Battle of the Atlantic, when the Germans were forced to temporarily withdraw their U-boats. This was due mainly to the increasing production of more effective naval weapons, improved anti-submarine tactics, and crucially, aircraft. The very long-range American B-24 Liberator maritime patrol aircraft was instrumental in finally closing the so-called Black Gap, that part of the North Atlantic that could not be covered by land-based aircraft until the B-24 arrived. The Maritime Patrol B-24 had previously been assigned another role, which was considered to be more important, namely, as a strategic bomber. From Leyte to Paramushiro, from France to the Philippines, makers of many of this war's headlines had been B-24 Liberators, and the men who flew and fought them. As one wartime account put it, "The Lib is heroine of many a wing and a prayer story. Flak-gutted B-24 brings back airmen. Lib beats off 8 enemy fighters, comes home on 2 engines. It sounds as if the Liberator comes home itself, while pilot and crew relax and enjoy the ride. But the men who flew safely back from battle in these planes know the B-24's ability to take punishment is only half the story, a good, solid half. But the other half is know-how. It's the sum total of information you have about any plane that will determine whether you can bring it back after it has been badly shot up. Air power also sustained operations in the most inhospitable theaters of war. In Burma, the Allied accomplishment in building a new supply road, the Lido Road into China, was largely made possible by the supply of materials by air. Burma and the Pacific also saw extensive use of resupply by parachute. Deep inside Japanese-occupied territory, the Chindits in 1944 even created makeshift airstrips to fly in troops and supplies. In every theater, from the jungles of Southeast Asia to the frozen wastes of the Arctic convoy routes, the transport aircraft had become as vital to the prosecution of war as the bomber and the fighter. The Germans enjoyed air supremacy on the Eastern Front until 1943. Obsolete Soviet types like the Polikarpov 115S and 116S were no match for German fighters. A German pilot recalled those early days. "In my opinion, it was always easier on the Eastern Front. When war broke out, the Russians were not as well trained as us, and their weapons were not as good as ours. The aircraft were not as modern as our 109s and 190s. Consequently, in 1941, the Russians experienced great losses at the beginning, but he added a crucial caveat: this changed very quickly. The Russians never lost their urge for battle, even though they experienced great losses. The strong aeronautical design tradition possessed by the Russians meant that by mid-1943, they were introducing aircraft like the MiG-3, perfectly capable of matching the Luftwaffe. 20,000 British and American aircraft supplied under Lend-Lease proved to be a great asset, and some Western Allied fighter squadrons even fought on the Eastern Front for a time. Thus, the Germans found themselves facing not only improving Soviet designs, but also British Hurricanes, American P-39 Airacobras, and P-40 Warhawks. The Eastern Front, which had seemed so easy in '41, had become a relentless war of attrition. By 1944, with the P-51 Mustang escorting American bombers deep into Germany, and the RAF introducing the Hawker Tempest, which, like later versions of the Thunderbolt, could fly at over 450 miles per hour, the balance of air power had shifted decisively. The strategic bombing forces in Britain were passed to Eisenhower's command in order to prepare for the cross-channel invasion, while the bomber barons American Carl Spaatz and Britain's Arthur Harris believed it was a mistake to switch their attacks from Germany. The contribution they made to the success of Operation Overlord was immense. They destroyed the Nazi defenses, special anti-invasion weapons, gun positions, E-boat pens and hideouts, the defenses that Hitler had been building and strengthening the length of the Atlantic Wall. They destroyed railway centers, engine repair shops, and rolling stock, hindering the movement of German troops and supplies. Hitler would have to rely on the network of railways in occupied Europe to move reinforcements rapidly to wherever the Allies attacked. The aim of the Allied air forces was to ensure those railways could not carry the load. On D-Day itself, June 6, 1944, the German Air Force was conspicuous by its absence during the days following the landings. For this, the world owed a debt to the squadrons of Fighter Command, who kept up a non-stop watch over the beaches and convoys. Between June 6 and June 12, 10,000 sorties were flown. By D+4, the first landing strip was available to Allied fighters for refueling and emergency landings. The skies over Normandy belonged to the Allies. In the autumn of 1943, RAF Bomber Command had opened a third major offensive under point blank, this time against Berlin itself. It was to be the grimmest battle of the air war, due to the formidable defenses around the German capital. Berlin was attacked several times during the winter of 43 to 44, but hopes that the RAF could achieve another Hamburg were in vain. Bomber losses rose drastically as the battle wore on. Berlin, although bruised, was not destroyed. For RAF Bomber Command, it was a battle lost. In September 1944, the bombers returned to Germany in force. Oil was now the top priority, although city busting continued. The production of nearly half of Germany's liquid fuel and almost all of its aviation gasoline was concentrated in just 8 huge synthetic oil plants. All were vulnerable, for they could not be dispersed and relocated like aircraft factories. Their machinery was complicated, the process continuous, and stores of hydrogen and fuel made the plants highly inflammable. Heavy attacks stopped production completely until damage could be repaired. As the Luftwaffe continued to attack bombers in the air, the large numbers of Mustangs now in the sky made success ever harder to achieve. Germany's infrastructure was being steadily destroyed, but it was the attack on Dresden in February 1945 which brought the morality of area bombing to the fore. 1,350 American bombers of the 8th Air Force streaked their vapor trails into the dawn. For 2 full days, miles of bombers hammered the city, which lay near the advancing Russian front. They hit Dresden hardest of all. The city had virtually no targets of military significance, yet much of it was destroyed and 50,000 lives were lost. Even so, the bombers continued to blitz Germany until the very end of the war. Arthur Harris remained defiant. "We propose to entirely emasculate every enemy center of war production if necessary. We are well on the way now to that end." During this time, larger types of bombs were used, ranging from the 8,000-pound type to the 22,000-pound Grand Slam, which the RAF used against viaducts and other difficult targets. 1944 saw the advent of the jet fighter. The German prototype Heinkel He 178 was the very first jet aircraft, having actually flown as early as August 1939. RAF officer Frank Whittle had been working on jet engines in Britain for many years before his Gloucester Whittle first flew in May 1941. But it was the British Meteor that first saw operational service, engaging German V-1 flying bombs. Germany's great hope was the Messerschmitt Me-262. A pilot who flew it recalled the experience. The performance and the flight characteristics were so overwhelming. The impression of jet flight first time in a pilot's life is something extra, but then came one of those decisions that may have altered the course of the war. When Hitler saw this aircraft for the first time, the pilot recalled, he asked Messerschmitt, "I was present at this time. Is this aircraft able to carry bombs?" And Messerschmitt said yes. Hitler asked, "How many kilos?" "Perhaps 500 for sure, 250. And Hitler said, "This is the Blitz bomber, the fighter bomber which I have been requesting. With this aircraft, I can fight the coming invasion." And this was the death sentence for this aircraft being used as a fighter, as the interceptor it really was. The Me-262 was delayed into service as a result. Other German innovations included the Me-163 Comet rocket plane, reaching a speed of almost 600 miles per hour but with only enough fuel for 90 seconds of flight. The Lockheed P-80 Shooting Star was the jet fighter introduced by the Americans, but although two were sent to Italy in the spring of 1945, it entered service too late to see action. In the war in Southeast Asia and the Pacific, the Japanese used their bombers to spearhead their Oriental blitzkrieg. They did not see bombing as decisive in its own right, but air attacks on the Philippines, Singapore, and elsewhere undoubtedly shattered the morale of the defenders. The Allies, on the other hand, were out of range of mainland Japan for much of the war. Before June 1944, only one air attack was made on Japan, the strike by B-25 bombers from the carrier Hornet in April 1942. It was no more than a morale raiser for the Americans, a gesture of defiance rather than a blow of substance. It was not until the massive Boeing B-29, which could carry a 20,000-pound bomb load over 3,000 miles, came into service in 1944 that land-based American bombers could reach Japan. The B-29 was first sent to India and to bases in southern China, making its first attack on Japan from China on the 15th of June, 1944. The Japanese then launched an attack into southern China, and the B-29 bases had to be evacuated. However, in the midsummer of that year, the capture of Saipan and Tinian in the Marianas Islands gave the B-29 alternative bases within range of Japan just 1,465 miles from Tokyo. Towards the end of November, they resumed high-altitude attacks. The results, in terms of bombing accuracy, were disappointing. Japanese fighters were shooting down and damaging an increasing number of B-29 Seths, not without cost to themselves. The B-29 force then made a fateful decision: switch to night bombing and attack at low level, hoping to improve accuracy. Since many Japanese houses were built of wood, incendiaries made up most of the bomb load. The first of these attacks was made against the Japanese capital, Tokyo, on the night of the 9th and 10th of March, 1945. The result was devastating. 2 square miles of the city totally destroyed. This led to attacks on other Japanese cities. Iwo Jima, captured at the end of March 1945, brought Japan within P-51 Mustang range and meant that the B-29s could resume daylight raids joined now by B-17s. The bombing of Japan continued throughout the summer of 1945, destroying much of the remaining industry. The Japanese began to make signs for peace, but would not accept unconditional surrender. A large proportion of the population wanted to fight on to the bitter end, despite the obliteration of their cities. This led to the decision to use the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and then Nagasaki, and consequently, surrender. It could be argued that the pre-war air theorists had finally been vindicated. The crew of the Hiroshima mission saw it with their own eyes, that cloud of boiling dust and debris, that tremendous mushroom, and beneath it, the ruins of an entire city. Arthur Harris, to the end of his days, maintained his belief in the bomber's power. "There are a lot of people who say that bombing can never win a war," he said. "Well, my answer to that is that it has never been tried yet, and we shall see. Germany will make a most interesting initial experiment. Japan will provide the confirmation. However, it was the weapon and not the delivery system which had proved decisive. The future capability of the atomic bomb was to prove immense, and with that, the nature of warfare itself was transformed forever. The long strategic bombing offensive against Germany was not decisive on its own. It failed to break the morale of the German people. It could not prevent German war production from peaking during late 1943, and the cost in bombers and in the lives of aircrew was staggering. One veteran recalled the early toll with painful precision. "We lost 100 Blenheims in the first 12 months of the war, because we started losing 5 out of 10 on the first bombing raid of the war." An American bomber crew described one ill-fated mission in particular. The command decided they would try an experiment very early in the war, go in under radar, down low, and not fly at high altitude. They came in at a very low altitude and tried to fool the Germans. It didn't fool the Germans at all. We got the living hell knocked out of us. That was the last low-altitude flight they ever flew in a B-17. The same was true on every front, on every side, in every cockpit and every turret. The men and women who fought this war in the air, from the Spitfire pilots over Kent to the B-29 crews over Tokyo, from the Il-2 pilots on the Eastern Front to the Coastal Command, crews hunting U-boats in the Atlantic, All of them faced odds that no training could fully prepare them for. One American recalled, "On that particular flight, we went in at 8,000 feet instead of going in normally at 25,000 feet. And it was much too low, much too easy a target for the anti-aircraft guns." Another veteran spoke for all of them when he said, "Flying was dangerous. It was much more dangerous than before the war. And you didn't like the idea of being killed. Especially you didn't like the idea of being burned to pieces or just burned and surviving." Some came home, many did not. And those who survived carried the memories with them for the rest of their lives. However, the bombing offensive did make a significant contribution to the defeat of Hitler's Germany, a contribution that compensated, in the grim arithmetic of war, for the high losses in men and aircraft. Air power did not win the Second World War alone, but it is impossible to imagine that war being won without it. From the canvas biplanes of 1914 to the atomic fire over Hiroshima, the story of air power in the 20th century is a story of extraordinary ingenuity, extraordinary courage, and extraordinary destruction. It is a story that must be told and remembered, because its lessons have not grown less urgent with the passing of time. Because remembering is not just an act of respect, it is an act of defense against the forgetting that allows history to repeat itself. In the Second World War, a new generation of planes takes aerial combat to deadly new heights. Fighter planes designed with one purpose in mind: to destroy the enemy in the sky. The F-6F Hellcat was engineered with a single objective: to defeat the Japanese Zero in dogfights over the Pacific. The Messerschmitt Me-262, history's first operational jet fighter, would come screaming in from above high and fast before its targets even knew it was there. Torpedo planes, their pilots threading through curtains of anti-aircraft fire, would release their deadly payloads within 2,000 yards of an enemy ship, the torpedo slicing through the water to penetrate hull armor and explode with devastating results. Carrier planes loaded with what official Navy pictures called a deck load of death, ready for delivery. And daredevil pilots who volunteered for the most dangerous missions imaginable. The skies above every continent and every ocean become battlefields, and the wings that flew through them would decide the fate of the world. This is the story of the aircraft and the aviators who changed the course of history. From the first desperate dogfights over England to the final bombing raids over Germany and Japan, the war in the air was a war of innovation, courage, and sacrifice on a scale the world had never seen. It was fought not just with bullets and bombs, but with engineering breakthroughs, new engines, new armor, new tactics that pushed the boundaries of what humans could build and what pilots could endure. It was fought by young men and women, some barely out of their teens, who climbed into machines of aluminum, steel, fabric, and plywood, and flew into the face of death. Their stories, drawn from personal testimonies, declassified records, and the memories of the survivors themselves, deserve to be told. And they begin over the skies of Britain in the summer of 1940. Months into World War II, Nazi Germany has invaded most of Western Europe, Poland, Belgium, France. Only Great Britain stands between Adolf Hitler and total domination of the continent. The Battle of France is over. The Battle of Britain is about to begin. Over the next several months, the German Air Force, the Luftwaffe, sends wave after wave of deadly bomber and fighter aircraft to attack British military sites, towns, and the capital city of London. Hundreds of planes, bombers, fighters, dive bombers. The bombs level homes and buildings. Families seek shelter in the train tunnels of the London Underground. The death toll climbs into the thousands. But the British are fighting back. Outnumbered and flying around the clock to protect their homeland are the pilots of the RAF, Great Britain's Royal Air Force. 19-year-old Tom Neal is a brand new pilot with only a few hundred hours of flight time.
I encountered my first Germans the beginning of July, with no experience at all. I flew 141 times in 16 weeks, and we were unprepared for war.
The Royal Air Force pilots from the Battle of Britain era are called the Few, and there were very few of them. They were worked almost all day long, every day, to repel the relentless German attacks, to beat back the aerial assault that threatened to bring Britain to its knees. And the plane that carried many of them into battle was the Hawker Hurricane. The Hurricane was, by the standards of the day, an altogether different kind of aircraft. Neal flew it with a mixture of respect and affection.
The Hurricane was was an altogether different aircraft. We used to go through the cloud at 140 miles an hour, climb up to the enemy, and work up a bit of speed before we could attack the bombers.
During the Battle of Britain, the airplane that shot down the most enemy aircraft was the Hawker Hurricane.
The Hurricane was the RAF's first monoplane, a plane with a single pair of wings, which made it more steady and more aerodynamic in flight.
The Hawker Hurricane was a super tough and great flying airplane. It was very, very stable, and it had many guns, and that made it a perfect firing platform to attack these German bombers as they came over.
The Hurricane, quite simply, outperformed expectations from the word go.
The Hurricane, of course, outdistanced and outperformed from the word go.
But even with that stability, the Hurricane still lacked many of the sophisticated innovations of other modern planes. Instead of being built strictly from aluminum or steel, the Hurricane had a metal and wood-framed tail covered by durable linen. The RAF kept this more primitive design because it made the plane lighter and more maneuverable in the air, and far less of a hassle to repair on the ground.
Parts of the airplane are still fabric, and when they would get damaged, they were much, much easier to repair. They'd be up flying the next day.
Engineers designed its linen to be weatherproof and airtight, treating the fabric with a sealant called aircraft dope. But aircraft dope had a serious and terrifying drawback. It contained nitrocellulose wood pulp, loaded with nitrogen. Any nitrogen concentration over 12% is highly flammable. In combat, fires caused by damage to the Hurricane's engine or fuel tanks could travel through the frame and ignite the nitrocellulose in the tail, setting off a deadly chain reaction.
The first thing that happened was the fire came up into the pilot's face, hands and feet, and they were always hideously burned. And you had to get out of the cockpit in about 3 or 4 seconds as you were barbecued, absolutely.
Despite that risk, the Hurricane was durable, fast, and reliable in the air. On September 15, 1940, a day, now remembered as Battle of Britain Day, Neil and his squadron experienced firsthand just how well the Hurricane performed in a dogfight during the Luftwaffe's heaviest bombing raid over London.
I remember attacking a chap from the outside and getting very, very close, and I chased it down the Thames, and suddenly the tail touched the water, and he flopped down into the water. We had an enormously successful day.
Victorious, Neil and his squadron returned safely to base, but as the Battle of Britain dragged on, it began to take a terrible toll on British morale.
To see London in those days, it was awful. There were so many cases of widows and thousands of people being bombed.
22-year-old Ken Wilkinson was a flying officer whose squadron fought day and night to defend Great Britain from the Luftwaffe's relentless attacks.
Whenever there was a raid coming in over, I'd be scrambled and go off to intercept.
And Wilkinson flew one of the RAF's most famous airplanes, the Supermarine Spitfire.
The Spitfire was designed absolutely new. It was faster, it could fly higher.
The Supermarine Spitfire was a fighter pilot's plane. It was little and it was maneuverable. It was very, very popular and very effective.
Known for its sleek body and distinctive elliptical wing, the Spitfire was equipped with blazing Browning, 303 wing guns, and a 1,600 horsepower Rolls-Royce Merlin engine.
An awful lot of power. They were such good engines. You got full power in next to no time.
But despite the Spitfire's powerful engine and advanced design, the RAF still faced a daunting challenge. The Germans attacked targets throughout southern England, launching their planes from several places in Western Europe. With this wide range of approaching enemy aircraft, it was absolutely critical for Wilkinson and his fellow pilots to know where to intercept these attacking planes. And to accomplish that, the RAF relied on an innovative technology the Germans did not yet possess: radar. The word itself was an acronym: radio detection and ranging. It used a series of radio waves to detect the presence of incoming objects. All along England's eastern coast, the RAF constructed a series of early warning radar stations using metal towers, codenamed Chain Home.
We had all those pylons all around the coast. At first, they were very hazy, but later on they got to be quite clear. Radar meant that we knew pretty well who was coming, and generally in what sort of numbers.
A radio transmitter in these massive metal pylons created radio waves that increased in wavelength as they traveled outward in an expanding arc. The waves reflected off incoming planes, determining speed, size, and the direction of travel. This data was sent back to a receiver and tracked by RAF observers.
They could actually sniff out these German airplanes that were coming and scramble their few fighters up to intercept them.
With this knowledge of when and where to engage, Wilkinson and his Spitfire squadron took off to intercept a group of German Messerschmitt Bf 109 seconds. But combat in the air was faster than anything on the ground.
I went into a steep turn because there was a 109 behind me, and then nothing happened. So I sort of came out of the steep turn, and I was all alone in the sky. That was how fast air fighting moves. It just goes like that.
Separated from his squadron but unharmed, Wilkinson returned to base, with the innovative chain-home radar system patrolling the skies from the ground and the sleek and fast Spitfires and sturdy Hurricanes fighting the Luftwaffe in the air. The RAF eventually won the Battle of Britain.
We were aware, very much indeed, that we were fighting to save England. We were the only force capable of resisting the Germans.
But the war was still only just beginning. By late 1941, the Empire of Japan was rapidly expanding its control throughout Asia. The United States, still officially neutral, reacted to this growing threat by sending its naval fleet to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, hoping that a strong American presence would deter the Japanese. 20-year-old Stuart Hedley was a seaman first class in the U.S. Navy, stationed on the battleship USS West Virginia, anchored in Pearl Harbor on the morning of December 7th. He had woken early that day for a simple reason. He was supposed to meet his girlfriend for a picnic.
She said, "I'll be here at the dock at 9 o'clock to pick you up." Well, there were no motor launches leaving that morning, believe me, other than to pick up bodies out of the water.
Just before 8 in the morning, the first of two waves of Japanese airplanes launched a deadly surprise attack on the U.S. naval fleet in Pearl Harbor. It claimed 2,400 American lives. The sailors were shaken into action. Hedley was immediately ordered to his battle station.
I ran across the deck, and as I was going up the ladder, here come a Japanese torpedo plane down our port side.
Dozens of ships were damaged and several sank, including the battleship USS Arizona, which produced a massive fireball after a torpedo struck its ammunition stores.
Bam! There went the Arizona. And I estimated there were about 30-some-odd bodies that went flying through the air.
Hedley's own battleship, the USS West Virginia, was hit by 7 torpedoes.
When they dropped those torpedoes in Pearl, you could see them coming through the water. They were about 15, 20 feet under the water, but you could see them coming.
Hedley escaped by swimming beneath pools of burning oil on the water's surface.
I was not an underwater swimmer, but I swam underwater that morning.
The Japanese launched more than 350 airplanes during the attack. Nearly 80 of them were the famed and much-feared Mitsubishi A-6M0. Among the pilots flying protective patrols that morning was Kaname Harada, a skilled Zero aviator who would carry the weight of that day for the rest of his life.
これが一番信頼もありましたし、パイロットを一番大事にした飛行機ではないかな。
The Zero itself was one of the most innovative fighter planes in existence in 1941, engineered specifically for long-distance attacks like the one on Pearl Harbor.
The reason that they were such an effective force for that attack, that sneak attack, is because of their long range.
No other carrier-based fighter in the world could fly as far. To achieve it, the plane had strict weight limits, with a skin constructed from a light yet durable aluminum alloy called extra super duralumin, produced by Sumitomo Metal Industries. It was rigid enough to provide the structure the plane needed, but light enough to keep the airplane remarkably nimble. These specifications gave the Zero not just range, they maximized its horsepower to weight ratio, making it faster and more maneuverable than Allied fighter planes.
It didn't leave any protection from enemy fire, and the fuel cells were only covered by a very thin sheet of aluminum, and so they caught fire very easily when they were hit.
The attack on Pearl Harbor shocked the nation and stirred the U.S. military into action.
Truthfully, I did not hear any anger. Even when we all collected together that evening, I think it was the fact that we were so stunned by what happened. But there was the attitude that they'll pay for this.
And President Franklin Roosevelt, addressing Congress the following day, gave the nation the words that crystallized its resolve. 4 months later, in the rough waves of the Pacific Ocean, an audacious top-secret mission to bomb Japan was underway aboard the American aircraft carrier USS Hornet. The flight deck buzzed with activity as Lieutenant Dick Cole hurried to his plane.
When they announced on the PA system that Army pilots man your planes, the main object of myself and the rest of the crew was to get there before Colonel Doolittle arrived.
Doolittle was Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle, a legendary racing pilot, aviation engineer, and commander of this secret mission. Cole was his co-pilot.
We all thought that he was probably the best pilot in the world. It was a very great honor for me to be able to fly with him.
American forces lacked a base close enough to Japan for a bomber attack. So this mission called for the bombers to do something unprecedented: launch from an aircraft carrier, fly hundreds of miles to their targets in Japan, and then fly hundreds of miles more before landing in China.
The idea of flying good-sized bombers off of the aircraft carrier in the enemy territory was really something completely new.
To launch successfully, the bombers had to carry a 2,000-pound bomb load and hundreds of gallons of fuel for the long flight, yet be light enough to take off in a very short distance. For the mission, Doolittle chose the rugged North American B-25 Mitchell, a twin-engine bomber capable of flying long range, but smaller and lighter than other bombers.
The question really came down to, can the B-25 pick up enough speed in the distance available before the end of the aircraft carrier in order to take off?
A crucial factor was what engineers call a weight-to-distance ratio. The lighter the plane, the shorter the takeoff distance needed. Even 10% of additional weight could increase the plane's takeoff distance by more than 20%, the difference between lifting into the air or crashing into the ocean. Before attempting this risky launch, Cole and the other men trained at Eglin Field in Florida, practicing takeoffs in less than 500 feet, the length of a carrier deck, and less than half the distance they had previously needed. To make the weight limits, the sturdy B-25s were stripped down to essentials and modified to accommodate the necessary fuel, the 5-man crews, and the bombs.
Our bomb load was incendiary bombs, and our target was northwest Tokyo, the city. Anything that would burn, whether it be houses or factories or anything.
On April 18, 1942, the aircraft carrier Hornet cruised toward Japan. 16 bombers were readied for launch as 80 courageous airmen prepared to avenge Pearl Harbor.
The mood was serious. It wasn't worrisome or apprehensive or anything like that. We all realized that being crew members, that we relied on each other.
Cole's crew made the first attempt. After a successful liftoff, one by one, the other planes followed. From then on, Cole said, all the airplanes were on their own. Flying at low altitude to avoid radar detection and enemy fighters, the Doolittle Raiders reached their targets unnoticed.
We were able to pull up at 1,500 feet and drop our bomb.
Leaving their Japanese targets in flames, the B-25s headed for preset landing sites in China. But low on fuel over enemy-occupied territory, plans changed.
We flew until the fuel warning lights came on, and at that time Colonel Doolittle said they were going to have to bail out.
The crew jumped from the airplane and parachuted down over China. Cole, Doolittle, and the crew reached the ground safely and, with the help of Chinese locals, evaded Japanese capture and returned to American bases.
The purpose of the mission was to give the American people a boost.
After their harrowing journey, the Doolittle raiders were hailed as heroes. With a bold vision and tenacious planning, they had stunned Japan and helped strengthen America's resolve to win the war. The raid also forced the Japanese military to reconsider its defensive strategy, pulling fighters back to protect the home islands, fighters that were desperately needed elsewhere. It was a turning point, not of territory, but of spirit. After the attack on Pearl Harbor, the U.S. military was forced to get up to speed quickly. But amid the news of destruction and defeat, an exclusive group of American pilots had been secretly preparing to fight the Japanese not in the Pacific, but in China. They were called the Flying Tigers, and 26-year-old pilot Tex Hill was one of the squadron leaders.
God, I mean, those early days after Pearl Harbor, it was very dark. But the only bright spot was our group over there, because we were beating them.
Since 1937, Japan had been at war with China as the Japanese attempted to expand their control throughout Asia. To assist China, the United States organized the American Volunteer Group, nicknamed the Flying Tigers, under the command of General Claire Chennault.
Chennault was a person who was very dynamic. You knew that this guy really knew what he was talking about. He was the type of guy you'd follow him anywhere.
Chennault's Flying Tigers flew the Curtiss P-40 Tomahawk, a durable fighter plane perhaps best known for its long nose painted with the group's trademark, a menacing shark mouth.
The P-40 Tomahawk was America's best Army fighter at the beginning of World War II. It had relatively heavy machine guns. It had a powerful Allison V-12 engine.
But as good as the P-40 was, it was far outmatched in maneuverability by Japanese fighters, particularly the Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa, what the Americans called the Oscar.
Typical to most Japanese airplanes at the time, it was very small and very light and super maneuverable.
One reason for this agility was its wings, which were equipped with special butterfly flaps, paddle-shaped flaps that could extend from the back of the wings during sharp turns. In most airplanes, making a sharp turn drastically changes the way air flows over the wing, reducing speed and lift and forcing pilots to make wide turns. But in the Oscar, the butterfly flaps extended to increase the area of the wing, changing the lift characteristics and allowing the pilot to turn at high speed while keeping the airplane remarkably stable. In close combat, the Oscar could outturn a P-40 and maneuver behind it, putting the American in range of its guns.
It could turn on a dime, and you never wanted to get into a turning dogfight with an Oscar.
You just don't turn with a guy. Don't even think about turning with him. If you do, you're going to get shot down.
Fearing that the Oscar's exceptional turning ability would prove deadly for his heavier P-40S, Chennault devised an innovative combat tactic that played to the Tomahawk's strengths, its durability, and firepower. He instructed the Flying Tigers to avoid dogfights entirely and instead attack the Oscars from above in a deadly dive and slash attack. The P-40's sturdy design allowed it to endure the extreme forces of a fast dive, something the nimble Oscar simply could not do.
In a dive, there's no way that anything can stay with them. The Japanese, if they ever tried to follow you in a dive, they'd pull the wings off.
After their first engagement on December 20th, 1941, the Flying Tigers spent the next 7 months using these daring dive tactics to overcome Japan's technological edge.
It worked really well. The Flying Tigers lost about 12 airplanes, and they shot down approximately 299 Japanese airplanes over China.
By the summer of 1942, Tex Hill was twice an ace, an aviator who has shot down 5 or more enemy aircraft.
We got a $500 for each plane destroyed, and I was paid for a 12 and a quarter airplane with AVG.
In the dark days after Pearl Harbor, the success of the Flying Tigers made them instant legends at home, and Hollywood even cast John Wayne in a role inspired by Tex Hill. But for the real Hill, modesty prevailed over his bravery and success. World War II was now truly a global war. While the Americans fought across the Pacific and prepared for the great air campaigns over Western Europe, the most brutal fighting was happening in the East. Eastern Europe erupted as Germany invaded the Soviet Union in Operation Barbarossa. More than 3 million German troops overwhelmed the Soviet army, in what remains the largest military invasion in history. Desperate for every resource available, Soviet leader Joseph Stalin authorized something unprecedented: the first female bomber regiments. Physics student Irina Rakobolskaya was one of the first women to volunteer, and she soon became chief of staff for the all-female 588th Night Bomber Regiment. They were well-trained and fiercely committed to defending their homeland.
Women were used because Russia was short of manpower and short of pilots, and there were women in Russia who were extremely capable aviators and able to lead combat squadrons.
In the spring of 1942, the regiment was sent to the front lines and equipped for combat with the old-fashioned two-seated Polikarpov Po-2, a biplane constructed of plywood and oiled fabric. It was extremely fragile. By any measure, it was much more like a World War I airplane than a World War II airplane. The Po-2 was rudimentary in every way. Its top speed was less than 100 miles per hour, while German warplanes averaged nearly 400. But the pilots quickly learned to exploit its advantages. The Germans nicknamed them Nachthexen, the Night Witches, for their elusive midnight raids. The Night Witches maneuvered through a dangerous game of stealth and survival. The slow and flimsy Po-2 lacked any protective armor, so the women relied entirely on surprise.
When they were close to their aim point, they would switch off their engines and glide in silently to drop the bomb.
As the pilots throttled back, cutting the engine's fuel supply, the Po-2 was able to remain aloft due to the force of lift generated by the flow of air around the plane's wings, counteracting the plane's weight. The Po-2's light frame and fabric wings helped maintain lift longer, allowing the plane to glide forward as it descended toward the target. Silently maneuvering through the freezing night air over the German lines, these brave women dropped their bombs, dodged fragments from their own explosions, and evaded German anti-aircraft fire. Then the pilots throttled up their engines and made a dash for home to refuel, rearm, and go out to bomb again. The Night Witches were the first women of any nation to fly in combat. Using the outdated Po-2 and inventive tactics, these young women flew more than 24,000 bombing runs, during which 30 of them lost their lives. After the invasion of the Soviet Union, Germany held most of Europe in its clutches. On the Eastern Front, German troops now drove toward the Russian city of Kursk. It was a calculated move to sever the region from the rest of the Soviet Union. In this epic showdown, millions of men and thousands of powerful German and Soviet tanks clashed in what became the largest tank battle in history. Nikolai Olavniakov was a Soviet pilot flying his first combat missions above this titanic struggle. From above, the battlefield at Kursk was an apocalyptic sight, a landscape of burning tanks, cratered fields, and columns of black smoke rising for miles in every direction. Olavniakov attacked German ground forces with a powerful aircraft, the Ilyushin Il-2 Sturmovik. The Il-2 was a rugged two-seater ground attack plane with a deadly arsenal of bombs, rockets, and machine guns. Unlike bomber and fighter aircraft, ground attack planes were specifically designed to fly in low over the enemy, often at altitudes of only 100 feet, and bombard targets on the ground, like the German tanks and guns pounding the Soviet army at Kursk. These dangerous ground attack missions forced Olavniakov to face barrages of explosive shells fired from German anti-aircraft guns.
When you design an airplane for ground attack, what you want to do is sort of anticipate the damage it's going to receive from being very low to the ground.
Most aircraft were built with aluminum alloys, strong for their weight, but not strong enough to protect against an onslaught of ground fire. To shield the plane during these attacks, the Il-2's fuselage was uniquely engineered with heavy steel armor. Steel, an alloy of iron and carbon, is far stronger and stiffer than aluminum.
Where most airplanes have sort of beer can thin skin, this airplane had really thick steel skin that covered the engine, covered the main fuel tank, and covered the pilot, and allowed him to operate in this ground fire and survive.
The steel was also malleable, meaning during manufacturing, the plates could be shaped into the contours of the aircraft frame. Loaded with this heavy armor and large guns, the Il-2 earned the nickname winged tank. The tank-like armor and weapons added significant weight, which slowed the plane considerably.
Compared to a fighter, the IL-2 is much bigger and not quite as deft. In a lot of ways, it's like driving a moving truck as opposed to flying a sports car.
Its hard steel surface could deflect light ammunition and indirect hits, but high-powered munitions at the right speed and trajectory could still penetrate the armor and bring the plane down. Olavniakov was more fortunate than many. In 212 combat flights, his plane was never shot down. Flying the hard-hitting wing tank, Olavniakov and other brave Il-2 pilots helped the Soviet Army hold off the Germans at the Battle of Kursk. It proved to be a critical turning point in the war, and from that point forward, the Soviets went on the offensive. The tide of war was beginning to turn. After the invasion of the Soviet Union, Germany held most of Europe. In a desperate battle to slow the Nazi war machine, the Allies began targeting enemy factories with a series of devastating air raids. The clear, cold skies over Germany erupted in storms of exploding shrapnel. Flying directly into this lethal anti-aircraft fire called flak were more than 200 American B-17 bombers on their way to their targets.
Now, that's when you get scared, because you just hear boom, 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 boom. Now, that flak would scare the heck out of you.
Despite the threat, the bombers cluttered the German skies and relentlessly dropped over 640,000 tons of bombs, determined to destroy Hitler's regime. These aerial assaults owed their success to one of the toughest bomber aircraft of the war, the Boeing B-17 Flying Fortress.
These bombing missions that took place over occupied Europe involved at first hundreds of planes and then thousands of planes by the end of the war.
With more than 12,000 mass-produced, each B-17 housed four 1,200-horsepower Wright Cyclone engines and had room for up to 10 crewmen. It could carry a bomb load of over 4,000 pounds deep inside enemy territory, withstand intensive flak, and ward off enemy fighters with its formidable arsenal. To defend itself, the B-17 was equipped with 12 .50 caliber machine guns. Gunner Mason Ho operated two of them in one of the B-17's most innovative features, the ball turret.
The ball turret is kind of like this, in between the tail position and the top turret position. All you can just see is that little ball.
The ball turret on a B-17 was a small metal and glass sphere that hung down under the airplane. It protected the belly of the airplane. A man rode in this little bubble.
A man rode inside this little bubble, entering through a hatch from inside the plane. Because of the cramped space, the ball turret gunner was usually the smallest person in the crew.
Then they open the hatch door, and then you crawl down in there. And I was small in those days, 128 pounds.
Sitting in a near-fetal position, Ho took aim with the twin .50 caliber machine guns by looking down between his feet, all while remaining vulnerable to flak and enemy fighters.
You lay down on the floor, and you're like this, and your guns and everything's right in between your legs. You're kind of in a position like this. You don't move much.
The ball turret was driven by hydraulic motors operated by controls near the gunner's head, and it could rotate in almost any direction below the plane, what engineers called degrees of freedom.
You can go all the way around in this way, and this, which is real comfortable.
The ball turret gunner could actually spin his turret that whole 180 degrees under the airplane. He had cutoff points so he didn't shoot through his own propeller of the airplane, but otherwise he had free motion to guide his guns and his little ball turret in any direction he wanted.
Together with the B-17's other machine guns, the ball turret helped create a nearly impenetrable defense against attacking German fighters.
You got to be on the ball. And just as soon as you see him, boy, you got to hit him.
Although the Flying Fortress lived up to its name, for Ho and every other crewman, the threat of flak and enemy fighters was ever present.
Man, I felt kind of scared down in that thing, but I just didn't really show it. I was proud to be down in there, really. I was proud to be down in there for my country.
Back in the United States, the war was consuming an unprecedented amount of resources. Families survived on rations of food, clothing, and gasoline, and every manufacturer churned out supplies for the military. But perhaps the biggest impact was on people. With millions of men serving overseas, women were offered jobs that had never been available to them before, including in aviation.
I was absolutely thrilled with flying. The sky, the land, everything was boundless and without any borders.
I love flying, and I would be hopefully helping the war effort and at the same time doing something that I really like to do.
Recreational pilot Bernice Falk Haydu and War Department employee Dawn Rochelle Seymour were prime candidates for a new top-secret program, Women Air Force Service Pilots, the WASPs.
Initially, when the program started, they weren't sure whether or not the women would be able to fly military aircraft, so we were started as an experiment.
To help the Army Air Forces fill the jobs left behind by men overseas, aviation pioneer Jacqueline Cochran began the WASP program with over 1,000 hand-picked female civilian pilots. The WASPs trained on military aircraft, each clocking several hundred hours of flight time.
She wanted to prove that women indeed could fly every aircraft in the Army, and she didn't want just one special woman to do this. She wanted a group of women to do it.
Despite their non-military status, the WASPs learned to fly the B-17 Flying Fortress, the P-51 Mustang, and the B-25 Mitchell. They took on a wide range of missions crucial to the war effort, ferrying newly built planes from factories to Army bases, performing maintenance flights and engine checks.
I did engineering training as well as utility pilot. You would have to fly it in a certain manner for a certain number of hours to break the engine in.
But one of the riskiest jobs involved live ammunition.
Here, thousands and thousands of young men, between the ages of 18 and 20 perhaps, were learning how to fire the 50 caliber machine guns.
Called tow targeting, the WASPs flew their planes downrange while towing a long target sleeve. The gunners used these towed targets to learn how to lead to fire a little bit ahead of the target to compensate for the bullet's time in flight.
Gunners had to learn how to lead a target, fire a little bit ahead in order to compensate for the time in flight. It's a simple scientific principle, but a little bit of a hair-raising mission for the WASPs on occasion.
While no WASPs lost their lives during tow training, 38 WASP pilots were killed during other dangerous training missions, and plane crashes courageous women whose names may not be widely known, but whose memories remain etched in the hearts of their fellow pilots.
My best friend was killed during the war, but there was no provision made because we were civil service at that time. The war brings back all these emotional issues for us that we keep down below, I suppose, and don't bring out every day.
Because of their civilian status, the women were not initially recognized for their service. For decades after the war ended, the WASPs and their supporters petitioned Congress to receive the military recognition they so rightly deserved, a fight that was, in its own way, as tenacious as anything they had faced in the cockpit. They finally won that recognition in 1977, more than 30 years after the war had ended.
We didn't get the benefits that had been initially given out, but that wasn't our motive. Our motive was to get the recognition.
On the Western Front, the United States and its allies had defeated German and Italian forces in North Africa and were now fighting to gain a foothold in Europe. Before they could invade by land, the Allies took to the skies with a daring air campaign. West Point graduate Benjamin Cassidy Jr., a pilot in the U.S. Army Air Force's 79th Fighter Group, took off from a base on the French island of Corsica for his first combat mission of the war.
Well, I remember it very well because what we did was we broke through the overcast, and it was a sheet of clouds, and there were the German Me-109s. So they came down on us.
Despite the Allied momentum, the Luftwaffe still dominated the skies over Europe. The Messerschmitt Bf-109, also known as the Me-109, was a fearsome adversary, with its sleek aerodynamic design, powerful 12-cylinder engine, and deadly 20mm cannon.
The Me-109 was the Germans' best fighter at that time of the war.
It was the Germans' best fighter at that stage of the war, and it had been terrorizing Allied bombers and their escorts for years. But Cassidy was well equipped for this confrontation. His plane, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, was new and innovative, designed specifically to take on Germany's finest aircraft and beat them at their own game.
If you looked at a P-47 on the runway, it was a monster, and a powerful, capable monster. Weighing in at 9,000 pounds empty, it had a 40-foot wingspan and stood many feet higher than other fighters.
The P-47 was a genuine powerhouse. It carried 4 machine guns in each wing and up to 3,000 pounds of weaponry and bombs, making it one of the heaviest fighter planes in the war. Its rugged aluminum and steel frame concealed the R-2800 Double Wasp, an 18-cylinder engine that produced a stunning 2,800 horsepower. That was almost double the output of the German Me-109, and more than enough to keep the heavy Thunderbolt in the fight.
This was an enormous technology improvement, and it made the Double Wasp unique in the power that it could produce.
The R-2800's superior power helped Cassidy fly higher and out of sight of the Germans, and that advantage helped him score his first aerial victory.
I saw the one that get on my leader's tail, so I was able to shoot him down.
But the Double Wasp engine was more than just powerful. It was incredibly tough, especially during strafing runs, when pilots attacked ground targets at low altitude.
Well, strafing is when you see a train particularly, or a convoy of trucks, that you can come down on them and just shoot them up with your wing guns.
In a later mission, Cassidy's plane took heavy damage while attacking a German airfield, what the pilots called an aerodrome.
We were up strafing an aerodrome. Well, I got hit badly, and I was able to get out of the range of the machine gun that hit me. I got hit in the engine. Then we got to the Mediterranean Sea. It got to be pretty antsy that I'd even get back.
The Double Wasp engine was such a success that the U.S. used it to power other legendary aircraft, including the Grumman F-6F Hellcat and the Vought F-4U Corsair, whose distinctive inverted gull wings and powerful engine made it one of the most recognizable planes of the war. For pilots like Cassidy, who went on to fly 117 combat missions over Europe, the P-47's toughness gave them the security they needed to complete their missions and come home alive.
I was always able to get home. I never had to bail out in combat. It was an aircraft that would get you home.
In a war where survival was measured one mission at a time, that kind of reliability was worth more than all the speed and firepower in the world. The Double Wasp helped the Allies break the Nazis' hold on Europe's skies, and with air superiority finally within reach, the path was opening for the ground forces to take the war to Germany itself. In the Second World War, a new generation of planes takes aerial combat to deadly new heights. Fighters designed to outmaneuver one another in the open sky. Dive bombers engineered to deliver devastation from above. Torpedo planes built to skim the waves and punch holes in the mightiest warships ever put to sea. And daredevil pilots, men who climbed into cockpits knowing the odds and flew anyway. This is the story of the machines and the men who flew them, of engineers who solved impossible problems under the pressure of wartime deadlines, of pilots who trusted those machines with their lives, and of a handful of aircraft that changed the course of history. The planes of the Second World War were not mere tools. They were extensions of the men who flew them, fragile, powerful, and unforgiving. Every innovation, every mechanical breakthrough, every modification made in a factory or a field hangar carried the weight of lives in the balance. A better engine meant a pilot came home. A stronger wing meant a bomber reached its target. A longer fuel tank meant the difference between victory and a watery grave in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. From the beaches of Normandy to the volcanic ash of Iwo Jima, from the frozen skies above Berlin to the vast blue waters of the Philippine Sea, these wings carried the war and the hopes of nations on their shoulders. The stories that follow are drawn from the men who were there, who climbed into those cockpits, who felt the engines roar beneath them, and who lived to remember what it meant. Some of them are still telling those stories, and every one of them begins the same way, with a young man looking up at the sky and deciding to fly. June 6, 1944. The rain-soaked beaches of northern France. Allied forces launch an audacious plan to liberate Western Europe from Nazi control. The D-Day invasion begins with an intense bombardment of the French coastline, and along 50 miles of heavily mined shoreline, More than 160,000 Allied troops struggle through a gauntlet of exploding artillery and machine gun fire from German strongholds. Above those beaches, fighter pilot Archie Maltby provides cover for the men below. A member of the 365th Fighter Group nicknamed the Hellhawks, Maltby took off just at dawn. By the time he reached the coast, the landings were already underway. Maltby saw something no amount of training could have prepared him for. You couldn't help but bleed a little bit for the guys that were down there. The water along the shoreline was already red around the edges. From the air, Maltby said, it looked like a mixture of hell. Maltby spent D-Day in his Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, attacking Nazi planes in the air and bombing targets on the ground. The P-47 was a beast of an airplane nicknamed the Jug for its milk jug shape. It was designed to take on Germany's best fighters, including the deadly Messerschmitt Bf 109, a plane known for its superior climbing and diving and armed with a 20mm cannon that, as Maltby put it, was pretty effective. You didn't want to get lined up with that too well, he said, if you could help it. But the P-47 had to do more than dogfight. It also had to escort Allied bombers at high altitude, and that created a daunting technical challenge for engineers. At 20,000 feet or higher, the altitude of many bomber escort missions, the air contains about 10% less oxygen, decreasing its density. The P-47's induction system, which measures and directs the flow of air into the engine, becomes far less efficient in that thin air. As Maltby explained, airplanes are always faster and produce more horsepower at sea level rather than way up high. Engineers solved this problem with an innovative power booster called a turbo-supercharger. Through a complex system of ducts, both the exhaust from the engine and outside air were channeled into a wheel-shaped turbo-supercharger positioned behind the cockpit. Inside, the air was tightly compressed, boosting the percentage of oxygen before sending it to the engine. The end result was cool, compressed air at high-altitude performance that typically was not attainable, but now was, thanks to that turbo-supercharger. With denser air pumping through its engine, the P-47 was now capable of high performance and maneuverability at both low and high altitude, making it an ideal patrol plane for the D-Day landings and more than a match for the German Bf 109. In the weeks after the Allied invasion of Normandy, Maltby and his P-47 faced a test from a group of Bf 109s. We just came off the run, Maltby remembered, and the top flight was being attacked by 109s, so I just turned into them, and I closed too quickly, and I fired, and this guy blew up right in front of me. It was amazing that the P-47 could actually turn just about as well as the Bf 109. For Maltby and the Hellhawks, the turbo-supercharger transformed the P-47 into one of the deadliest combat planes of the Second World War, a demonstration of how technology and innovation would help the Allies during their push toward victory. And the feeling Maltby carried about the P-47 for the rest of his life was, in his own words, very simple. I owe my life to it. After D-Day, Allied forces were rapidly advancing against Nazi Germany from all sides. American and British bomber aircraft streaked through the skies, determined to decimate the remaining industries fueling Hitler's war machine. Many of these strategic bombing raids were escorted by a valiant group of African-American fighter pilots, men who quickly earned a reputation for fierce fighting in dangerous conditions and a tenacious defense of the bombers in fighter. Their care. William Holloman, one of those dedicated fighter pilots, put it plainly. Our job in the 15th Air Force was to protect our bombers. We would protect them against enemy fighters. His fellow pilot, Robert Friend, was even more direct. The thing was, get those bombers home. I don't care what else. Holloman and Friend belonged to the 332nd Fighter Group, known as the Red Tails because of the distinctive red paint on the tails of their airplanes. That red paint served a practical purpose, as Friend explained. It meant the bomber crews didn't have to call and ask who was flying alongside them. They could look out the window and say, oh, that's the 332nd, because they're the Red Tails. The men of the 332nd were among the first African-American pilots admitted into the United States Armed Forces. Prior to their existence, there was a widespread belief that African-Americans were not capable of flying aircraft under combat conditions. At the time, many places and organizations in the United States, including the military, denied people of color the same rights and opportunities given to white people. Friend remembered that prejudice clearly. I didn't like people telling me what I couldn't do, he said. They didn't want me. They were going to accept me. We were determined. In June of 1941, the U.S. Army Air Corps began training black pilots at the new Tuskegee Army Airfield, a racially segregated military facility in Alabama. As Holloman recalled, when you signed in with the recruit, if you didn't say white, you went to Tuskegee. After their training, Holloman, Friend, and other airmen of the 332nd were eventually stationed in Italy at Ramitelli Airfield, a captured enemy base. And it was there that they picked up the assignment they would become best known for bomber support. For the long bomber escort missions against Germany, the Allies needed a fighter plane with long-range capabilities, and there was one clear winner, the North American P-51 Mustang. It was a fighter plane with high power and maneuverability in combat, and critically, it could fly hundreds of miles farther than other Allied fighters. Holloman remembered those long missions. The P-51 had much more range, he said. We flew P-51 missions like 7 hours. The Allies needed the P-51S to go deep into Germany. And to accomplish this, engineers utilized an innovative external fuel tank that attached under the wings, nearly doubling the available fuel.
America, land of abundance, learns to mobilize its waste, to save its scrap, to provide more metals for war.
But wartime metal shortages forced engineers to think creatively. They built these drop tanks using a waterproof chemical compound of paper and glue. The glue-infused paper was shaped over forms, assembled, and coated with a fuel-resistant lacquer and aluminum paint, sturdy yet disposable. When the fuel was used up, pilots could drop the empty tanks, improving the plane's aerodynamics. These resourceful drop tanks allowed Holloman, Friend, and the other P-51 pilots to gain as many as 900 additional miles of flight, more than enough for their missions across Europe. The P-51, as historians would later affirm, was really the only American fighter that was able to fly with the U.S. bombers all the way to Berlin for the missions that hit at the very heart of Germany. The Red Tails bravely flew nearly 1,500 missions, most of them in the P-51. They protected bombers with such heroism and gallantry that they were awarded the Distinguished Unit Citation, but even with such honors, they still faced social injustices in the military and at home. Friend reflected on that painful contradiction with characteristic resolve. I think that in some ways, segregation, racism made us a stronger group, he said. We realized we were trying to prove something, that we could do the job, and we were committed to that. Later known as the Tuskegee Airmen, these courageous African-American pilots broke down stereotypes and paved the way for racial integration in the United States military. Holloman's pride, decades later, remained undimmed. Proud of myself being there, he said, and proud of all the fellows that I served with. The story of the Red Tails is, in many ways, a story within a story, not only about the technology that carried them into battle, but about the barriers they broke on the ground. The P-51 Mustang gave them the range to fly deep into enemy territory. The paper drop tanks gave them the fuel to get there and back. But it was their own determination, their own refusal to accept what others said they could not do, that made them legends. The sky, it turned out, did not care about the color of a man's skin. It only cared whether he could fly, and the men of the 332nd could fly. The Allies' dominance in the skies forced Hitler into increasingly desperate measures. 3 months after the D-Day invasion, a massive explosion rocked West London. The blast killed 3 people, wounded 22, and left a 30-foot crater in the ground. The mystery explosion was initially thought to have been caused by a gas main leak, but people soon learned the truth. It was the result of a terrifying new weapon created by German scientists. It was called the V2 rocket, and it was nicknamed the Vengeance Weapon. Fired from hidden locations far from the front lines, the V2 had a range of 200 miles and stood almost 46 feet high, taller than a 3-story building. It was the first long-range guided missile in the world. Franz Stahl, a German artillery specialist assigned to prepare and fire the rockets, understood their significance. Germany in wartime had really advanced technology, he said. They were desperately looking for the thing that could turn the tide of the war. The V2 was a devastating weapon. It carried 2,200 pounds of explosives to its target, following a ballistic path until it crashed into the ground and detonated. Traveling at 4 times the speed of sound, the supersonic rocket approached in silence. Its victims never heard it coming, and when it landed, the massive explosion was powerful enough to obliterate an entire city block. But the story of the V2 carries one of the war's darkest chapters. The rockets were built underground through a top-secret Nazi program. To save costs on production, the Germans used slave labor. Over 6,000 political prisoners, prisoners of war, and Jews victims of Hitler's genocidal Holocaust were brought from the Buchenwald concentration camp. They were forced to work in and build the underground tunnels where the rockets were constructed. Thousands died from the brutal conditions, and in an effort to make the rockets less effective, the bravest of the prisoners attempted to sabotage them, even under the threat of execution. As a result, many of the rockets failed to launch, often with disastrous consequences for the German crews. Without the benefit of today's GPS-guided rocket technology, the V-2 had to be carefully aimed on the ground toward the direction of its target. Once launched, an onboard guidance system helped maintain the rocket's trajectory during flight. This system consisted of 2 gyroscopes, freely moving rings and discs, that pivoted around an axis as the rocket moved. The main axis of the gyroscope disc remained stable. Data recorders measured the movement of the rocket's gyroscopes against their stable axis, which determined the rocket's position. This data was sent electronically to controls in the rocket's fins, which made slight corrections to elevation and direction, preventing the rocket from losing control and crashing. But the gyroscope was still primitive. As one expert explained, you could be relatively accurate. You could hit something like London, but you'd have a hard time hitting a specific block within London. Most of the rockets were fired from hidden locations and aimed at the cities of London and Antwerp, Belgium. They caused massive damage, inflicting heavy casualties on the civilian population. In London alone, the rockets claimed over 2,700 lives. By May of 1945, near the end of the war, the Nazis had launched over 3,000 Volts 2 rockets. The V-2 proved successful as a terror weapon, but Germany was unable to stop the wave of Allied forces closing in from all sides. The rockets, built by slave labor in concentration camps, remain one of the darkest chapters of the war, a reminder that technological achievement, divorced from human conscience, can become an instrument of unspeakable cruelty. But even as the V-2s rained down on London and Antwerp, the war's other great theater was reaching a climax of its own. Thousands of miles away, across the vast expanse of the Pacific Ocean, the United States Navy was about to engage the Imperial Japanese Fleet in a confrontation that would decide the fate of the entire war in the Pacific and test a different breed of aircraft in a very different kind of war. While the Allies pressed forward in Europe, the war in the Pacific raged with a fury all its own. Halfway around the world, from the skies over Germany, a different kind of air war was unfolding. One fought not over cities and farmland, but over endless stretches of open ocean where a pilot who went down had nothing beneath him but miles of cold, dark water. Allied forces fought to liberate the Philippine Islands from Japanese occupation. The United States Navy's Third Fleet patrolled the dangerous island waters to support the Allied troops and intercept the Imperial Japanese Navy. And the aircraft that would decide the outcome were unlike anything flying over Europe. On October 24th, an American reconnaissance plane spotted nearly 30 Japanese ships in the distance. The American aircraft carrier USS Intrepid received the order to attack the enemy armada. Navy pilot Ben St. John was one of the men who would carry out that attack. "We were waiting for the fleet to show itself," St. John recalled. Every carrier, every ship had torpedoes, armor-piercing bombs set aside, reserved for the fleet. St. John flew a Grumman TBF Avenger, a rugged 3-seat torpedo bomber with a powerful engine and folding wings. Torpedo bombers were designed to carry and release a 2,200-pound torpedo, a self-propelled missile packed with deadly explosives, deployed to sink enemy ships. John had chosen this role deliberately. "I wanted to be a torpedo pilot," he said, "because I felt that's the place I could do the most damage." In his Avenger, St. John joined the third wave of aircraft that launched from the Intrepid to assault the Japanese fleet. As his plane neared the enemy ships, he saw something that stopped him cold, one of the largest warships ever put to sea. It was the Japanese super battleship Musashi, the pride of the Imperial Japanese Navy. It was obviously the biggest thing we'd ever seen, St. John remembered, and with the most guns. The anti-aircraft fire was intense, more than we had ever seen. The Musashi was roughly a third larger than anything in the United States Navy's inventory. To make their attack on the Musashi, the Avenger torpedo bombers had to maintain a consistent speed and altitude, but this made them easy targets for the Japanese gunners. "If you stayed straight and level for any length of time," St. John explained, "they knew what you were doing. So it was the case of picking your spot, dropping the torpedo, and getting out of there." The weapon they carried, the Mark 13 aerial torpedo, was an engineering marvel with almost no margin for error. Unlike bombs that explode on impact, the torpedo was designed to fall through the air and then travel through water toward its target. It was dropped from an altitude of up to 2,000 feet and had to enter the water at an angle between 22 and 32 degrees. If the water entry angle was wrong, the torpedo could plunge too deep or skip off the surface, either damaging the weapon or throwing it off course. In our mind, Street, John said, we knew altitude and what speed we had to have to get that thing to go in at the proper angle. The torpedo's impact with the water tripped a valve, sending fuel to the motor that ran the attached propeller. Once it reached a preset depth and distance, the torpedo became armed to explode on contact with the ship's hull. The idea was to release the torpedo within 2,000 to 1,500 yards of the target, St. John explained, and then turn away. If your aim was right, the torpedo would hit the target, penetrate the hull armor, and explode with devastating results. Waves of fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo bombers pummeled the Musashi with more than 30 bombs and Mark 13 torpedoes. The Musashi was, as St. John put it, pretty much out of order as a result of the attacks from the USS Intrepid. Eventually, the super battleship sank beneath the waves. As one historian noted, the Musashi's sailors had a song, the refrain of which went, "The Musashi is unsinkable. If Musashi sinks, Japan will sink with her." And that, of course, was precisely what happened. After 3 days of fighting in the waters around the Philippine Islands, the Allies succeeded in breaking Imperial Japan's command of the Pacific Ocean in one of the largest naval battles of modern times. St. John looked back on it with the quiet pride of a man who had done what he was trained to do. "I can look back on it now," he said, "and say that's exactly what I trained for, and to hope and pray that I managed to handle it properly." While the Americans fought their way across the Pacific, the air war over Europe was reaching its terrible crescendo. American and British bombers struck deep into the Nazi heartland with around-the-clock bombardment, and the Luftwaffe threw everything it had into the sky to stop them. For the German fighter pilots, every mission now felt like it could be the last. They were outnumbered, outproduced, and increasingly outgunned. But they still had machines worth flying, and they still had the skill and the courage to fly them. Erich Brunout was a pilot in Jagdgeschwader 51, one of the most decorated fighter wings in the Luftwaffe. He flew the famed and much feared Focke-Wulf FW-190, a sturdy and deadly fighter with a powerful 14-cylinder BMW radial engine. "It flies well," one expert assessed. "It's fast, it climbs well, and it performed well." All around, the Focke-Wulf 190 series was just an amazing aircraft. But as the war ground on, American airplanes became more advanced, flying higher, farther, and faster than the German FW-190A model. To keep ahead of the curve, German engineers replaced the radial engine with an inline V12 lighter, faster, and capable of producing far more horsepower. After A, B, and C models, this became the D model, nicknamed Dora. It was a powerhouse, with the speed and versatility to attack high-altitude bombers and their lethal fighter escorts. But the new engine brought a new problem. The longer nose added more weight toward the front of the aircraft, and that greatly affected the plane's weight and balance, a crucial aspect of aircraft engineering. The heavier nose moved the plane's center of gravity forward, the point where it was perfectly balanced in the air. This could cause the nose to point downward, making takeoffs and landings more dangerous. If the nose was not level during flight, airflow over the plane was disturbed, destabilizing the aircraft. To correct this imbalance, engineers were forced to make further adjustments. They essentially had to make the tail longer or put weight back there. They just took a plug, so to speak, another extra 18-inch section of fuselage, and they patched it right in and just made the fuselage a little bit longer. With the weight and balance corrected, the improved Dora became a formidable fighter. But as effective as it was, the Dora came too late. Germany was unable to mass-produce it quickly enough, and the sheer number of Allied aircraft overwhelmed the German defenses. Bruno flew missions in his Dora throughout the war. After flying over 560 missions, he reluctantly surrendered to Allied forces. The Dora's engineering advancements are still admired to this day, but they were not enough to turn the tide. Meanwhile, Germany's troops were falling back on both fronts. In a last-ditch effort to slow the Allied advance, German forces destroyed their own bridges over the Rhine River, creating a 700-mile-long natural barrier that brought the Allies' ground troops and supply convoys to a standstill. But American forces were able to locate and capture the last bridge left standing, the Ludendorff Bridge, in the town of Remagen. Hitler ordered the bridge at Remagen destroyed at all costs. German forces threw every weapon in their arsenal at it, including fighter planes. One of the pilots assigned to attack the bridge was Lieutenant Ernst Dieter Bernhard, flying the Messerschmitt Bf 109, the pride of the Luftwaffe. Since its introduction in 1937, the Bf 109 had fought in nearly every major German engagement of the war, from the invasion of Poland to the Battle of Britain to the assault on Russia. The Bf 109 was designed to be different from the start. It was a truly modern airplane, sleek, lightweight, all-metal construction that allowed it to slice through the air at high speeds. It boasted an enormous amount of firepower. In addition to its wing-mounted guns, it carried a 20mm cannon built right through the center of the engine and propeller shaft. In German hands, it shot down more aircraft than any other fighter of the Second World War. One of the Bf 109's most innovative features was its body structure. Many airplanes at the time were built around a steel or wood frame for support, but the Bf 109 used what engineers called a monocoque structure. The monocoque design meant the weight and stress were carried by the shape, not by an internal frame. It worked like an egg, with the load carried by the exterior shell. By eliminating the need for interior support, the Bf 109 was lighter, faster, and more stable in the air. But like an egg, the monocoque structure was more fragile, and anti-aircraft fire could easily puncture it, leaving Bernhard vulnerable during his mission at the bridge. It was a trade-off that defined much of wartime engineering. Every advantage came with a risk, and every innovation created a new vulnerability. The pilot had to trust that the gains outweighed the dangers, and in the case of the Bf 109, more often than not, they did. Facing an intense artillery barrage from the Americans, Bernhard was unable to fly close enough to the bridge to score a direct hit. Days later, he encountered an even closer call when faced with an onslaught of American fighter planes. His aircraft was hit, and Bernhard was forced to bail out. He survived the parachute jump and landed back behind German lines. His mission failed, but he was grateful to make it out alive. The Allies' defense of the bridge at Remagen proved a huge success. American commanders would claim it as a crucial step during their final push toward Berlin and ultimately victory in Europe. By the final year of the war, Germany was being squeezed from all sides. The Luftwaffe, once the terror of Europe, was bleeding pilots and planes faster than it could replace them. Fuel was running out. Factories were being bombed to rubble. And yet, in the midst of this collapse, German engineers produced something that would change aviation forever. A weapon so fast and so radical that Allied pilots who encountered it thought they were seeing things. William Holloman, who had spent the war escorting bombers in his P-51, remembered the moment vividly. "We were flying a mission one day," he said, "and all of a sudden, zoom, something came through our formation." What was that? Nobody knew what it was. What they had seen was the Messerschmitt Me 262 Schwalbe, the world's first jet-engine fighter aircraft. Previously, planes had been powered by piston engines with propellers. The Me 262 had no propeller at all, creating an entirely different flying experience. First Lieutenant Jörg Sipjanka, who flew with a special German unit of Me 262s assigned to hunt down Allied aircraft on their night raids over Berlin, never forgot the sensation. The aircraft was easier to fly than any propeller aircraft because it has a nose wheel and it goes absolutely straight on takeoff. And there was no noise, no vibration, nothing. Fantastic. It was like being in a dream. Design work on the Me 262 had started before the war, but several issues caused delays, and it was not ready for combat until late in the conflict. Still, Hitler and his Nazi commanders believed the Me 262's state-of-the-art technology would help the Luftwaffe overpower the British and American air forces. Sipjanka shared that confidence. "It was so innovative," he said. "It was a hit from the very beginning for me. I said this is the future." The Me 262 was heavily armed with guns and rockets. It had swept wings and could climb to high altitudes quickly. At speeds of 550 miles per hour, it could fly 100 miles per hour faster than the Allies' fastest aircraft. What made this single-seat German fighter so revolutionary were the twin Jumo 004 turbojet engines. The Jumo engines, outside of a couple of flaws and the materials they were built from, are extremely similar, to this day, to modern jet engines. Like many aviation developments, The Me-262's jet engines stemmed from a need to make aircraft faster and generate greater thrust. Thrust is the force that moves an aircraft forward, countering drag, the force that pushes back. The greater the thrust compared to drag, the faster the aircraft travels. The new jet engine generated thrust with a mixture of compressed air and fuel that was ignited. The burning gases blasted out through the back of the engine, thrusting the aircraft forward. The performance was just off the charts compared to all the propeller-driven airplanes. That superior speed required Sipyanka and the other pilots to devise new methods for attacking the slower enemy bombers. The basic strategy of the Me-262 combat was to come in from above high and fast. It would shoot as it went past, and the Allied pilots essentially had no chance to counter that. It was very suited in our capacity as a night fighter. Fast, heavy armament, go up, shoot, and come down. That's it. During one of his night flights, Sipyanka encountered a British bomber, a de Havilland Mosquito, returning from a bombing raid over Berlin. He came into my range, Sipyanka remembered, and I made a brief burst, only 3 rounds, and the Mosquito started burning on the engine on the right side. It was hit and fell down. The Me-262 proved its worth in combat, but it came too late to alter Germany's path toward defeat. Bombing raids, material shortages, and production delays kept the Me-262 short supply. Only a few hundred ever made it into combat, but the technology of the Me-262 left a lasting legacy. As one aviation historian put it, the Me-262 symbolizes advance in technology and aviation development at its finest. With the introduction of the Schwalbe, the jet engine was here to stay. It would influence further generations of jet aircraft and revolutionize aviation around the world. As the Third Reich crumbled, the last days of the war in Europe played out in scenes that were equal parts desperate and surreal. The full horror of war returned to Germany itself, as Allied forces advanced rapidly toward Berlin. German pilot Sergeant Wilhelm Zimmernsohn felt the end approaching. Adolf Hitler, the German chancellor and leader of the Nazi Party, was dead, having committed suicide in an underground bunker just 3 days earlier. Knowing the war was lost and that they would likely face war crimes charges, high-ranking German officers scrambled to escape. At his assigned post in Austria, Zimmernsohn received his final order of the war: fly undetected to a predetermined meeting point and help top Nazi commanders evade capture. He was hand-picked for the mission because of his experience piloting one of the most versatile non-combat airplanes in the German Air Force, the Fiesler Phi 156 Storch. The Storch, German for Stork, was an aircraft of remarkable simplicity and ingenuity. What made it valuable for these types of missions was its ability to take off and land in very short distances, a capability known as short takeoff and landing, or STOL. This allowed the Storch to access areas that were much more difficult, if not impossible, for other airplanes that needed longer runways. As one expert explained, you can get in and out of extremely small places. You don't need an airport or even a runway. You just need a small meadow to get a Fiesler Storch in and out. The Storch's STOL capabilities were due, first and foremost, to its extremely lightweight construction. Engineers achieved this by making a lightweight airframe out of tubing, wood, and fabric. These lightweight qualities helped with something in aeronautics called loading factor, the ratio of the plane's lift to its weight. The Storch's long wings and light frame gave it a loading factor of just 10 pounds per square foot, only a fraction of other German planes, helping it maintain lift even at very low speeds. The Storch's unique abilities had been made famous in 1943. When one was used in a daring operation to rescue Italian dictator Benito Mussolini from a rugged mountaintop compound. That mission, carried out under seemingly impossible conditions on a rocky plateau high in the Apennine Mountains, demonstrated precisely what the little Storch could do: land where no other aircraft could, pick up a passenger, and disappear into the sky before anyone could react. The Storch had become the aircraft of choice for missions that required stealth, precision, and the ability to operate in spaces no larger than a farmer's field. For Zimmernsohn, those same STOL characteristics now allowed him to carry off his last mission of the war, taking off from a field in Austria to help Nazi officers escape. But Zimmernsohn was determined to save someone else too, and he brought on board a desperate stowaway, his wife. Zimmernsohn and his wife successfully landed at the designated meeting point in a small clearing, but further orders never arrived. The commanders he was supposed to extract never came. Zimmernsohn surrendered to the Allies as the war in Europe finally came to an end. His love of flying, the thing that had defined his life, was forever tainted by the harsh realities of war. In the Pacific, after years of destructive fighting, America was on the move and on the hunt for Japanese ships. Navy pilot Robert Turnell was part of a naval fleet called the Fast Carrier Task Force, stationed aboard the aircraft carrier USS Wasp. It consisted of 5 task groups. There were 20 carriers in that task force, which is a lot of airplanes. Naval warfare had changed drastically since the start of the war. Instead of ship-to-ship combat fought mostly by battleships, opposing ships now might never even get close enough to see each other. Fighter planes launched from aircraft carriers, a revolutionary concept at the time, battled one another in the air and struck at targets below. The sky was filled with flaming tracers and shell fire. The aircraft carrier had transformed the ocean itself into a runway, and the pilots who flew from those pitching, heaving decks had to possess nerves of iron just to take off and land, let alone fight once they were airborne. The Fast Carrier Task Force further enhanced this strategy by grouping several carriers together into a flotilla. The Americans created a highly mobile, floating air base that could act as the main striking force against the Japanese military. Turnell estimated the force carried probably 1,600 or 1,700 aircraft. "All we did," he said, "was go up and down the Pacific and hit targets." But for this strategy to work, the Navy needed to control the skies, and its primary fighter plane, the Grumman F-4F Wildcat, was falling short. It was slower, heavier, and less nimble than its Japanese rival, the legendary Mitsubishi A6M0. The Zero's lightweight construction made it extraordinarily maneuverable, a superb dogfighting platform and a better fighter than the Wildcat. As Turnell recalled, the Wildcat was an aircraft that you had to be an athlete to learn how to fly, because all the controls were manual. Engineers at Grumman Aircraft took a hard look at the Wildcat's flaws and replaced it with an entirely new fighter plane, the F-6F Hellcat. The Hellcat was designed with one purpose in mind: to defeat the Japanese Zero. Extensive technological and mechanical improvements were made, including automatically deploying landing gear where previously pilots had to crank it up and down by hand. The landing gear itself was also strengthened to better withstand hard landings on the pitching deck of a carrier. The cockpit was redesigned to sit higher, giving the pilot better visibility in combat and during carrier landings. And then there was the engine, a state-of-the-art Pratt & Whitney R2800, producing 2,000 horsepower. At about 70 miles per hour, faster than the Zero, the Hellcat held an enormous advantage. Its extreme speed, both in climb and in dive, gave it a decisive edge over the lightweight Japanese fighter. Turnell put it simply: the Hellcat was a much better fighter. It was bigger, had more speed. It was just a much better airplane. One more innovation set the Hellcat apart. To allow more planes to fit onto an aircraft carrier, Grumman co-founder Leroy Grumman implemented a concept called bio-inspired engineering. He looked to nature specifically, a bird folding its wings back to influence a new wing folding system called the stow wing. The stow wings used a series of hinges to pivot and fold backward, tucking close to the Hellcat's fuselage. This bio-inspired design saved enough space to double the number of planes that could be packed onto a carrier. More planes, as the Navy understood, equaled a stronger defense. With these improvements, engineers succeeded in making the Hellcat the Navy's #1 fighter and its answer to the Zero. Turnell experienced that advantage firsthand during a dogfight. 8 Zeros in the air, he remembered, and each one that came down, there was an F-6F sitting there with the guns loaded and cocked and ready to go, and we shot down 8 of them. The Hellcat, with its numerous technological innovations, went on to become one of the most versatile fighter planes of the Second World War, helping the United States Navy assert air superiority across the Pacific and the Fast Carrier Task Force drive toward Allied victory. In total, Hellcat pilots would be credited with destroying more enemy aircraft than any other Allied naval fighter, a testament to the engineers at Grumman who had studied the Zero's strengths, identified the Wildcat's weaknesses, and built a machine purpose-designed to win. The war's end was in sight, but the last miles would be the most dangerous. After nearly 6 years of fighting, the Allies turned their attention to Japan itself. United States warships bombarded the tiny volcanic island of Iwo Jima as U.S. Marines advanced over the black volcanic beaches of this rocky Japanese stronghold. Combat erupted into one of the most violent and relentless struggles of the entire war. After 36 days of intense fighting, the Allies gained control of the island. The victory gave them a strategic airbase closer to Japan for attacks against its main islands. But there was a critical problem that technology alone could not easily solve. The B-29 bombers flying missions over Japan were suffering terrible casualties from the Japanese defenses and from the long, punishing flights of 16 or 17 hours with no fighter escort. U.S. Army Air Force's pilot Jerry Yellen was in the 78th Fighter Squadron, a unit assigned to escort those B-29s. He flew the North American P-51 Mustang, a sleek fighter plane with a powerful Packard Merlin engine and handling that Yellen described in almost poetic terms. That was the airplane of the day. There's no question about it. It's like flying a gazelle, because the P-51 was very light on the stick and very responsive to what you were doing in maneuvers. The P-51 was capable of flying longer distances than other fighters, making it an ideal escort plane. But the missions to Japan and back were staggering 1,500 miles round trip over open ocean, without navigation equipment and with few landmarks to guide the pilots back to the 8-square-mile island of Iwo Jima. If they could not find it, they risked running out of fuel and disappearing into the vast Pacific. 8 square miles of land, one pilot observed, is really just a pinprick in the ocean. Navigation was critical, but P-51 pilots were a one-man crew with little time to look at maps. When you fly fighter planes, Yellen explained, you can't be looking in the cockpit. You have to be looking outside the cockpit. Navigating in a small fighter plane over miles and miles of empty ocean was, he said, a lonely and scary experience. Without GPS or radar technology available to them, the fighter pilots relied on an ingenious, low-tech solution, radio navigation. We couldn't navigate at all over water, Yellen recalled, but we did have a radio, and when we learned how to fly, we flew the beam. Flying the beam meant using radio range navigation to follow a moving target, typically a B-29 bomber. During missions, ground attacks, and dogfights, fighter pilots could fall behind the bomber formation. To help them find their way back, the B-29 navigators transmitted radio signals in Morse code, which were picked up by the straggling fighters. Yellen described the system. If you strayed to the right, you would hear Morse code for the letter U, he said. And then if you got to the other side of the beam, you might hear the letter D. If you were straight on the beam, you would hear just a solid tone in your earphones. Using this method, Yellen and his fellow pilots could pick up the sound of a B-29 from about 30 or 40 miles away, and that was how they navigated back over the ocean. This low-tech navigation system saved the lives of countless fighter pilots, allowing them to cross the daunting Pacific and land safely at their base on Iwo Jima. Yellen carried the memory with him for the rest of his life. The memory of every day, he said, and the pure purpose of every day that I fought for my country is permanently embedded in my memory. December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii. The morning was quiet, almost impossibly so, the kind of Pacific stillness that lulls you into believing the world is at peace. And then, in 2 horrifying hours, that peace was obliterated. The attack was led by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who had managed to move his aircraft carriers to a scant 256 miles off the coast of Hawaii, while the United States military slumbered in blissful ignorance. The assault was sudden, it was deadly, and the losses were staggering. 2,338 people were killed. Over 1,000 of them died from just one bomb when it reached the ammunition magazine aboard the USS Arizona. An additional 1,144 men were wounded. Over half of the Navy's ships were destroyed or damaged. 188 airplanes were reduced to cinders before they even had a chance to get off the ground. America was in a state of shock, and in the months that followed, there were more demoralizing defeats at the hands of the Japanese military. Soon, that shock hardened into something else entirely. It became anger. Across the country, people were asking the same question: when are we going to strike back? That question was answered on April 18, 1942, when a man named Jimmy Doolittle led a daring raid against Japan. It was America's first victory of the Second World War. It was also a message to the rest of the world that America was not just a frightened country on the other side of the ocean, but a force to be reckoned with. News of the raid electrified people. There was mayhem in the streets of America. Jimmy was already well known for his flying achievements, but after that raid, he became a national hero of a magnitude never before seen. It was as if nothing a man did before or after mattered. Over the years, many films have been made about that one event. Actors such as Robert Redford, Clark Gable, Spencer Tracy, and Alec Baldwin have all portrayed Doolittle. But in reality, leading that raid on Tokyo was just another day in this man's incredible life. This is the story of Jimmy Doolittle, a man who would earn his doctorate at MIT, but whose formal education started in a one-room schoolhouse in Nome, Alaska. A man who boxed in gin mills to pay for his dreams. But to understand how Jimmy Doolittle became the man who changed the course of a world war, we need to go back to a frozen, lawless town at the edge of the world, back to where it all began. James Harold Doolittle was born in Alameda, California, on December 14, 1898. His father, Frank, a carpenter by trade, had tried many ways to make his fortune, and the lure of the Alaskan gold rush was simply too much to resist. So at the tender age of 3, young Jimmy and his family moved to Nome, Alaska, at the turn of the century. Nome, Alaska, at that time, was one of the toughest towns in the world. There was no organized law. It had as many saloons and whorehouses as it did stores, hardly the place a mother would choose to raise her son. The locals resented newcomers flocking to their town in search of gold, and life was hard for the Doolittle family. Even at the age of 5, Jimmy found himself in daily fights just to get to and from school. He developed a reputation as a scrapper that wouldn't back down. When Jim was 7, his father gave him a single-shot .22 rifle. One day, he spotted a duck sitting in a mud puddle at the end of town. Having watched the local native Alaskans hunt, Jimmy crawled up to the puddle on his belly and shot the duck. He spent the rest of the day parading up and down the streets of Nome, .22 rifle in one hand, duck in the other. The great Alaskan hunter, all of 7 years old. Jimmy was settling into the primitive frontier life, and his mother wasn't happy about it. But it was a trip to Seattle with his father that changed everything. The boy was overwhelmed by the tall buildings, the automobiles, the trolleys, the stores. He was even surprised to discover that people actually painted their houses. The difference between lawless, crude Nome and the progressive city of Seattle left a lasting impression on the young Doolittle. He saw it as a future, and he wanted to be part of it. While Jimmy was in Nome, 2 brothers named Orville and Wilbur Wright were unknowingly setting the stage for his destiny, flying a strange-looking aircraft over the white sands of Kitty Hawk, North Carolina. After 8 years of brutal Alaskan hardship, Rosa Doolittle moved back to Los Angeles, California, to give her son a proper education. Jim's father accompanied them but soon returned to Alaska. The years growing up in Los Angeles would not only define who Doolittle was, but what he was to become. Luckily for the world, he wasn't cut out to be a farmer. He would also meet the 2 loves of his life, a girl named Josephine Daniels and flying, and he would marry both of them. While attending Manual Arts High School, Jim met Josephine Daniels, or Jo, as she was called. She was from a Southern family on a social level considered somewhat higher than the Doolittles. Jim was attracted to her, even though he considered her a little snobbish at times. She regarded him as an aimless roughneck who spent most of his time fighting or crashing his motorcycle. Jo got straight A's and was preparing for a career in library work. Doolittle was rarely seen carrying a book and appeared to have no idea what he was preparing for. So, of course, they fell in love. It was not exactly a whirlwind courtship. It would take Jo 7 years to say yes to marrying Jim. Jimmy's other love affair with flying started with an air show and a dog-eared copy of Popular Mechanics. From it, he built a full-scale glider, actually a hang glider with the pilot's feet serving as landing gear, with an 18-foot wingspan. Building it was easy for the mechanically minded Doolittle. Getting it into the air was another story entirely. The first attempt ended with a badly bruised body and a busted-up glider. After repairs, Jimmy tried another method, being towed by a truck. Picture this, Jimmy Doolittle racing madly behind a truck until the truck's speed exceeded his own, then being yanked off his feet and dragged along with his glider into a pile of rubble. Not quite the start you'd expect from someone who would go on to become the world's greatest flyer. But Jimmy was determined. He decided to install a motorcycle engine on a new glider. A storm destroyed it the night before he could test it. Jimmy took that as an omen and decided to put his flying career on hold. Years later, he learned that had he tested that motorized glider, it probably would have killed him. There was no money to spare in the Doolittle household, so Jimmy earned the cash to build his gliders by boxing in the gin mills of Los Angeles. He didn't want his mother to know how he was making the money, so he fought under an assumed name. If he won a fight, he received a gold watch which he promptly sold back to the promoter for $5. After graduating from Manual Arts High School, Doolittle spent a year at junior college, then went on to the University of California, where he studied mining engineering. At Cal, Jim became an outstanding gymnast and put his early fighting skills to work on the boxing team. He weighed 130 pounds. The lightweight and welterweight spots were filled, but they needed a middleweight that's 160 pounds. They were just fine with Doolittle. He'd already proven that if he could hit someone, he could knock them out, no matter how big they were. As a mining engineering student, he landed a summer job at the legendary Virginia City silver mines, the famous Comstock Lode, the largest silver strike in American history. To Jim, it was like Nome, Alaska, all over again. Most miners resented newcomers, especially college kids, but they would soon learn that Jim Doolittle was not your typical college kid. One day, he waded through scalding hot water to restart a pump and keep the mine from flooding. On another occasion, working at the 2,300-foot level, he was startled by the screams of miners and a runaway ore basket rocketing down a shaft, crashing 200 feet below when its cable snapped. Jimmy volunteered to be lowered into the airless shaft to retrieve the bodies of the dead men. Halfway down, his hat candle flickered out. He was running out of air. Other miners directed a fire hose down the shaft to try and get oxygen to the gasping Doolittle. Finally, a new cable was rigged, and Jimmy and the dead miners were pulled out. The college kid had become a rock-hard miner. In 1917, America joined the First World War, the war to end all wars. Doolittle did what most men were doing. He joined the Army, or to be more exact, the Army Reserve Signal Corps Aviation Section years later. It would become the Air Force. While patriotism was at a fever pitch across the land, Jimmy's reasoning was a little more realistic. He wanted to impress Joe Daniels' parents, who thought their daughter could do a lot better than a kid from the wrong side of the tracks who came visiting on a motorcycle. And of course, he wanted to be where the action was. Despite what her parents thought, Jimmy and Joe were married on Christmas Eve, 1917. Days later, he was called to active duty at Rockwell Field, San Diego, California. The plane Doolittle learned to fly on the Thomas Morse JN-4, or Jenny, as it was affectionately called, wasn't much to look at by today's standards. But to Jim, it was the most beautiful thing he'd ever seen. Soon, the world would learn that when James Harold Doolittle climbed into an airplane, anything could and did happen. It was no different on his very first flight. As Jim waited in his Jenny trainer to take off, two planes collided in midair and crashed on the runway directly in front of him. Jim and his instructor helped pull the dead and injured from the wreckage. The experience was enough to bring most young cadets to their knees. When the instructor asked if he was okay to continue with the lesson, Jim simply replied, "Of course, you bet." Jimmy was the original Iceman, and it was that Iceman's approach to flying that would keep him and many others alive in the years to come. After finishing flight training, he faced the realization that the Army was producing more pilots than airplanes. He was transferred to camps with no aircraft, where he painted barracks, collected trash, and performed maintenance. He studied engine repair in Ohio. And then came Gerstner Field in Lake Charles, Louisiana, known for its heat, mosquitoes, poor sanitation, and bumpy airstrip. But to Jim, it was heaven. It had airplanes. Not the Jennies he had learned on, but the newer, sleeker Thomas Morse S-4 Sea Scout, 30% faster than the Jenny and about 500% more dangerous. At the end of the day, when most pilots were enjoying a beer at the officers' club, Jimmy was still flying, making the plane do things he was told it wasn't designed for. But that little chunk of heaven was abruptly brought to an end when a hurricane destroyed the field and most of the planes on it and killed several pilots, and the war was ending. Jim was sent back to Rockwell Field as a flight instructor, under a commander named Colonel Harvey Burwell. Burwell believed in doing everything by the book. Doolittle believed rules were meant to be bent. The two formed an instant dislike for each other. The stories from those days read like a comedy of errors with occasional flashes of brilliance. Jim once casually sat on the wing of a plane as it came in for a landing, just to shock Colonel Burwell reviewing film footage. He was one of the first to fool around with wing walking. On another occasion, he flew his plane through an open hangar to help a ground crew sweep it out. During a planned 3-plane flight to Washington, D.C., He managed to destroy all 3 aircraft through a series of mishaps: soft sand, dense fog forcing belly landings in plowed fields. When he finally stood at attention before Burwell's desk, oil-soaked and in a tattered uniform being thoroughly chewed out, he saluted crisply, turned on his heels, and left the room, not realizing the seat of his pants had ripped open in the crash, exposing his bare backside to the colonel. No amount of explaining ever changed Burwell's mind about what that gesture meant. Up until then, Lieutenant James Doolittle had destroyed 4 planes at a cost of $30,000, one of them while chasing a goose. During his 5 months at Rockwell Field, he was grounded a total of 1.5 months and restricted to base for a total of 3. Years later, Jimmy would explain his antics by saying, "I had a lot of blood running in my veins at the time." But Jimmy wasn't always a prankster. He also took his job seriously and became one of the best instructors in the service. And it wasn't always fun. One day, a student veered in front of Jimmy during takeoff and was killed when the propeller cut off the tail section. On another training flight, a student pilot approached Jim's plane from below, hidden in the blind spot beneath the wing, and collided. The crash tore away Jimmy's landing gear and badly damaged the lower wing. With no engine and a wing threatening to tear off, Doolittle was going down fast. He chose to side-slip the plane in on its belly and landed safely. It was the kind of calm, analytical decision-making under impossible pressure that would define his entire career. After the war ended, the Air Service struggled to keep from being disbanded. Most countries in the world were making huge advancements in the airplane. Even newly defeated Germany was experimenting with commercial air travel. But America was still a young, short-sighted country, more interested in developing wealth than aviation. In 1920, Jimmy took part in General Billy Mitchell's amazing demonstration of sinking a battleship from the air. Mitchell had been telling anyone who would listen that the airplane was the future of the military. He had amazingly predicted that the Japanese would attack Pearl Harbor, and that air power, not naval power, would be the deciding factor in all future battles. When Mitchell boasted that an airplane could sink a battleship, the press jumped in until a demonstration was arranged. Even after Mitchell prevailed, sending an unsinkable German battleship to the bottom with 6 2,000-pound bombs, Congress refused to allocate funds for the Air Force. Politics, as it so often does, trumped common sense. But working with Billy Mitchell inspired Doolittle. He reasoned that if a plane could carry 4,000 pounds of bombs, why not 4,000 pounds of cargo, or 4,000 pounds of passengers? The airplane was more than a weapon. It was the future. In 1922, Jimmy attempted to make a transcontinental flight from Florida to California, stopping only once in Texas to refuel. The first attempt ended when a wheel caught a soft spot in the sand at Pablo Beach, catapulting the plane into the water. Jim was strapped in, upside down, and underwater, his flight helmet pulled down over his eyes. He thrashed about wildly until he discovered he was only knee-deep in water. A month later, he was back on the sands of Pablo Beach. This time, lanterns were set up to help him find the runway of hard-packed sand. He lifted off without incident, and 22 hours and 19 minutes later, he set down in San Diego, California, becoming the first person in history to cross the continent in less than a day. In 1923, the military recognized they had more than just an airplane flyer in their midst, and sent Doolittle to MIT to study aeronautical engineering. At the time, there was a giant gap between aeronautical scientists and pilots. The pilots didn't put much faith in flying with a slide rule and an algebra book. The scientists thought most flyers were just crazy for wanting to fly around in cracker boxes. Doolittle received not only his master's degree, but went on to earn his doctorate as well. He became the bridge between the two worlds, a man who could fly anything and explain why it flew. To attract attention to the upcoming Schneider Cup race, Jimmy flew his Curtiss R-3C Racer among the skyscrapers of New York at near street-level altitude. That wouldn't go over too well today. In fact, it didn't go over too well then, either. The next day, he set a new record of 232 miles per hour and won the race. If that speed record seems timid, consider that the overall average included slowing down to make 180-degree turns around pylons. And consider this: the top speed of the plane Doolittle had learned to fly in only 6 years earlier was a whopping 70 miles an hour wide open. Jimmy pulled out his old MIT slide rule to help win that race. He adjusted the pitch of the propeller to increase engine speed and he designed a different angle to approach the pylons. The Navy wasn't overly thrilled that an Army pilot had beaten their best. When Jim returned to McCook Field, he was given a parade through downtown Dayton, Ohio. He was issued a Navy uniform, and his car was decorated to look like a ship. A sign on the side read, "Admiral Jimmy Doolittle." For some reason, the Navy didn't think that was very funny. 6 months later, he would be awarded the coveted Mackay Trophy as the outstanding flyer in the world. He would become the first person ever to win the Triple Crown of air racing, the Schneider, the Bendix, and the Thompson. In 1926, Jim made aviation history once more. On a test flight over Wright Field, Ohio, he was testing a new addition to the rudder called a trim tab when the cable snapped. Losing your rudder in the air is like having the steering wheel come off your car at 100 miles an hour. The procedure of the day was to quickly abandon your aircraft. But Jimmy had a theory. From 5,000 feet, he literally stalled and floated the plane to the ground, gave it full power just before impact, and landed safely. Charles Lindbergh later told the press, "Jimmy is the only pilot in the world that could have pulled that off." That same year, the Curtiss Aircraft Company needed Doolittle to demonstrate their new P-1 Hawk fighter for the Chilean military. A few days before the demonstration, at a cocktail party where the local drinks were going down a little too easily, the talk turned to the famous actor Douglas Fairbanks and his on-screen acrobatics. Jim, the former college gymnast, ended up on a second-story ledge outside a window, imitating some of Fairbanks' moves. Not a problem, until the ledge gave way. This demonstration meant everything to Curtiss Wright and to the United States government. On the day of the demonstration, the huge crowd was shocked to see an ambulance roar up on the field and deliver Doolittle on crutches, both legs in casts. He was lifted into the cockpit, and his casted feet were wired to the rudder pedals. Jimmy lifted the P-1 Hawk into the air and put on an incredible show, breaking both casts in the process, feeling agonizing pain each time he moved a rudder pedal. When Germany's greatest ace, Ernst Udet, finished his own demonstration, Doolittle nodded to his delighted crew and announced he was going back up. He joined the German at 4,000 feet, and for the next 10 minutes they engaged in a mock dogfight in which Doolittle literally flew circles around the famous ace. Finally, Udet broke off and landed. Jimmy followed him in, but just before touching down, he flipped the plane on its back and buzzed the field upside down. The crowd went wild. A respectful Udet conceded it was the greatest exhibition of flying ever displayed. Not bad for a kid who'd trashed his first glider. Of all Jimmy Doolittle's achievements, he considered blind flying one of the most important. Most pilots of the day thought that when flying in fog or bad weather, they could feel or just know the direction and disposition of their flight. They were wrong. In many cases, dead wrong. Fog was the #1 weather hazard for landing an airplane. Many solutions had been tried: tail drags, weighted lines lowered from the plane, different types of sonar equipment, even dispersing fog with heat. All had limited effect. What was needed was a precision altimeter measuring distance from the aircraft to the ground, and a device that could give the correct attitude of the airplane, meaning the landing gear and the tail had to be level with the ground. Coming in with a wing down would spell disaster. Working closely with the Guggenheim Flight Laboratory and using his scientific background, Jim helped design the instruments needed to navigate in bad weather. On September 24, 1929, at Mitchell Field, New York, a hood was fastened over the cockpit of his consolidated NY-2 biplane, and Jimmy Doolittle became the first person in history to take off, fly, and land using instruments only. Many of the instruments and concepts he helped design are still in use today. The outside loop was another feat that captured the world's imagination. In a conventional loop, the plane goes up and over, and the pilot is forced down into the seat. In the outside loop, the plane goes down and around, and the medical consensus held that blood vessels would burst and vital organs could be ripped loose from the body. Many flyers had attempted it. All had failed or died trying. Jimmy had studied the structural design of the Curtiss Hawk and was confident it would withstand the stress. He was almost as confident his body would. On a clear day, 10,000 feet over Wright Field, Ohio, he nosed the Hawk into a vertical dive at 285 miles per hour, jammed the stick forward, and flew into the history books once more, proving the experts wrong. When reporters asked why he tried such a suicidal feat, he answered slyly, "It was just a spur-of-the-moment thing. The military, fearing a host of other pilots would kill themselves attempting it, immediately issued orders forbidding anyone from trying the outside loop. By 1932, Jim had set or broken just about every flying record there was. He even managed to tame the legendary GB Sportster, or the killer plane, as it was most often called. The GB was named after the Granville brothers, who started out as auto mechanics and got into airplane design. Jim said that flying the GB was like balancing a pencil on your finger. One lapse of concentration and it was gone. The plane had killed many flyers, including its own designer. Some considered it the most dangerous aircraft ever built. Doolittle won the Bendix speed race in it at a record 252 miles per hour, even lapping the competition. After setting the record, Jim simply said, "It flew like a bullet," a perfect description of a 1,400 horsepower engine designed to resemble an airplane. And then Jimmy abruptly quit racing. When asked why, he spoke of going to the well once too often, of never having known a racing pilot who died of old age. But it was more than that. Jim had learned that when he was racing the GB, the media would train cameras on his wife and children to capture their reaction if he crashed. In awe of all Doolittle's spills, thrills, and brushes with disaster, he considered the luckiest day of his life the day he met his wife, Jo. She brought stability and meaning into the life of a young, restless hellraiser. Doolittle had no doubt that without her support, he wouldn't have accomplished nearly what he did in life. She gave him 2 sons, Jim Jr., born October 2nd, 1920, and John, born June 29th, 1922. Jo ran a flawless household, from managing the family budget to whipping up dinner for unexpected guests Jim might bring home. When Jim was away for extended periods, Jo stepped in as both mother and father without missing a beat, all while being ready to move halfway across the country on a day's notice, which the Doolittles did on a regular basis. Jimmy wasn't going to let his family's last memory of him be an airplane exploding into a ball of fire. In the 1930s, the world was in a Great Depression, and each country was handling it differently. In America, people were put to work building dams, bridges, and roads. In Japan, people were put to work building up the military and trying to unite the nations of East Asia by force, if necessary. In Germany, a man named Adolf Hitler was giving speeches about German pride and dignity. At the request of the government, Doolittle toured many countries in Europe and Asia. He was shocked not only by the buildup in their armies, but by the superiority of their aircraft. Based on what he saw, Jim was convinced war was on the horizon, and when it came, he was just as convinced it would be won in the air. The United States Air Force lagged far behind the progress of other countries. Jimmy was very vocal about the need to build up a proper Air Force. Luckily, President Roosevelt agreed. Jim took a leave from the military and worked closely with Shell Oil's aviation division. He convinced them to perfect 100-octane gasoline, which was quite a gamble on both their parts. The first gallon cost Shell $1 million. And some referred to it as Doolittle's $1 million blunder. During the war, that fuel greatly increased not only the speed, but the range of Allied aircraft. England credited their victory in the Battle of Britain to having 100-octane fuel, while the Germans still had only 87. In 1940, Hap Arnold sent for Jimmy Doolittle. He wanted him back in uniform, but whatever plans he had for Jim changed drastically on December 7, 1941, Pearl Harbor. Some historians have given Jim credit for conceiving the raid on Japan. That isn't true. It was conceived by Captain Francis Lowe, Assistant Chief of Staff for Anti-Submarine Warfare. While flying out of Norfolk, Virginia, Lowe saw the shadow of his plane pass over the outline of an aircraft carrier painted on the field below, used for training purposes. The idea sparked. Could Army bombers fly off a Navy carrier? Hap Arnold put Doolittle in charge of the project because he considered him the only man on the planet who could figure out how to get a loaded bomber off the deck of an aircraft carrier. Normally, a B-25 required 2,000 feet to get airborne. Jim was given 500 feet to work with. Jim chose the untested B-25 for a very elementary reason: it was carrier-friendly, meaning it was the only bomber with a wingspan short enough to clear the command tower. The plane had to be completely modified. Extra fuel tanks made of rubber, a new bomb sight, so the secret Norden bomb sight wouldn't fall into enemy hands, broomsticks to replace some of the guns to lighten the load and hopefully fool enemy fighter planes from a distance, and the engines had to run better than a Swiss watch. The mission was top secret. Hap Arnold gave Doolittle a letter granting him top priority over any officer in the Army Air Force. Before training ever started, Jimmy told the men that the mission was highly dangerous and that the fatality rate could be 100%. That kind of says it all. He also told them that anyone who wanted to drop out at any time, any place, anywhere could do so, no questions asked. Nobody did. Originally, Jimmy was only brought in to handle the technical problem and train the crews not to lead the mission. One day, Jim went into Hap Arnold's office and presented his case for leading the raid himself. Arnold flatly said no, explaining that Jim couldn't lead every mission he was involved in planning. But Doolittle kept hammering away until Hap finally said it was all right with him if it was okay with Miff Harmon, his chief of staff. As Jim left the office, he smelled a rat. He sprinted down the hall and burst into Harmon's office, breathlessly explaining what Arnold had told him. Harmon, not wanting to override his boss's decision, shrugged and said, "Fine, Jim, you can lead the mission." As Jimmy was closing the door, he heard the phone ring, and then Harmon saying, "But Hap, I already gave him my permission." Hap Arnold had underestimated Jimmy Doolittle's foot speed. On April 1st, 1942, at Alameda Port, California, 16 of the original 24 bombers were loaded onto the aircraft carrier Hornet. The next day, they headed up the coast to San Francisco. Did the Japanese know something was up? Of course they did. They had spies, just as America did. But never in their wildest dreams did they think those bombers were going to be flown off the deck of that aircraft carrier. The original plan was to get within 400 miles of Japan before launching bomb-key military targets, then fly safely to prearranged locations in China. That didn't work. The Japanese, taking precautions against attack, had moved their picket line of patrol boats 900 miles off the coast, far out of range of carrier-based fighter planes. At 6:30 in the morning on Saturday, April 18, 1942, the general alarm sounded on the Hornet. They had been spotted by a patrol boat 823 miles off the coast of Japan. Another misconception about the raid is that Doolittle made the decision to launch. He didn't. The task force was under the command of Admiral William Bull Halsey. His immediate concern was the safety of his ships, 2 aircraft carriers, 4 cruisers, 8 destroyers, and 2 tankers. After the beating at Pearl Harbor, he couldn't risk losing carriers. At that distance from Japan, the chances of the raiders making it to China were slim. It was a difficult decision. At 6:32 in the morning, the order came: launch. The carrier Hornet was pitching badly in a rough sea. The winds were blowing at gale force proportions. Many of the crew doubted a B-25 could fly off that undulating deck in 40-knot winds. Doolittle was the first to go. When his plane roared down the runway and lifted into the air, the cheers could be heard above the storm. Jim would later describe his flight over Tokyo as routine. At the coast, he was met by 5 Japanese fighter planes but lost them through amazing evasive flying through the hills of Japan. Over the target, just as he was reassuring his crew that the flak was missing them by a mile, a burst rocked the plane, causing Flight Chief Sergeant Paul Leonard to comment, "Major, that was no mile." With the help of a tailwind, the planes did make it to the China coast. One plane flew to Russia due to mechanical problems. Because of bad weather, and with planes sputtering on their last gallons of gasoline, the crews were left with the choice of either bailing out or trying to crash land in the ocean. Doolittle let each plane's crew make their own decision. After 13 hours in the air and traveling 2,250 miles, Jim made the decision to abandon ship somewhere over the China coast. He hoped. After the crew had jumped, he put the plane on automatic pilot, shut off both fuel valves, double-checked that everyone was gone, adjusted his chute, and in his words, left the airplane. As Jimmy descended through the dark rain, he thought about his once shattered ankles and hoped for a landing that wouldn't damage them again. He more than got his wish. He suddenly landed in a rice paddy, sinking knee-deep in night soil, a polite name for human excrement. Later that night, seeking shelter from the chilling cold, Jimmy climbed into a large crate he came across on 2 sawhorses. It turned out to be a coffin, occupied by an elderly man. Spending the night with a dead man was not a problem for Jim. Trying to stay warm in the cold weather was. He survived the night, only to spend a nerve-wracking day with suspicious Chinese soldiers who thought he was a spy. Only after retrieving his parachute, which a farmer had snatched from the rice paddy, did the soldiers believe him. After a frantic week locating his scattered crew, Jim was taken to Chongqing, where he met with Generalissimo and Madame Chiang Kai-shek. Most of the crew survived. 11 raiders were killed or captured. 3 were executed by the Japanese. All the planes were lost. Jim felt he had failed. His first message to Hap Arnold simply said, "Mission accomplished. Bad weather over China. All planes lost." But he had no idea of the worldwide impact of the raid or what it did for the morale of the American people, who were literally celebrating in the streets. And he had no idea he would return to a hero's welcome and receive his country's highest award, the Congressional Medal of Honor. One day, soon after his return, Jimmy went into a drugstore to buy a tube of toothpaste, but he couldn't get it because he didn't have an empty tube to return a metal-saving measure of the day. He tried to buy several other items but was denied because of shortages. Finally, the clerk repeated a popular phrase of the time, "Don't you know there's a war on?" Jimmy just smiled and said, "Sorry, I've been away." But there were consequences to the raid that went far beyond heroism and headlines. In retaliation for the Chinese people helping the raiders over a 3-month period, the Japanese military systematically slaughtered 250,000 men, women, and children, 250,000 people. What military end that served has never been disclosed. There was also Seaman Robert Wall, who lost his arm when a wind surge pushed him into the propeller of the last B-25 as it prepared to launch. A search plane from the Hornet crashed at sea, claiming the lives of its pilot and radio man. And there was a young Chinese man named Tungsheng Liu who risked his life hiding raiders from Japanese soldiers. He would be made an honorary raider, and in 1947, he moved to the United States, where he became an aeronautical engineer. He retired in Monterey Park, California, and passed away at the age of 92. The Doolittle raid touched lives far beyond the men who flew the mission. When Eisenhower asked Hap Arnold to recommend someone to organize and lead the 12th Air Force during the invasion of North Africa, Arnold said Jim Doolittle. Ike met with Jim and then wired Arnold. Doolittle not acceptable. He still considered him too much of a hotshot pilot and not enough of an organization man. But Hap was persistent and finally won out. Jimmy chose Hoyt Vandenberg as his chief of staff. General George Patton was in charge of the ground forces. As a general, Jim led over 20 combat missions, always over heavily defended areas, at a time when most leaders were commanding safely behind the lines. Every time he led a mission, morale skyrocketed and losses went down. One night in England, Jimmy and famed flying ace Eddie Rickenbacker were watching from a hillside apartment as the Germans bombed London. A large piece of flak landed on the deck near them, and Rickenbacker commented, "A guy could get killed out here." Just then, a bomb exploded in the street in front of them, blowing them back through the glass doors of the apartment. Jim was bruised and battered, but his sense of humor was intact. As he lay on the floor, he managed a grin and said, "You know, Eddie, I think this is where we should have been in the first place." Jimmy had lost many friends during the war and had hardened himself to deal with it, but the loss of one man devastated him, Paul Leonard. Sergeant Paul Leonard, his flight chief from the Tokyo raid. When Doolittle was sure he had failed after the raid, Leonard had tried to cheer him up, saying that when they got back to the States, they'd not only make him a general but give him the Medal of Honor. Leonard had also told Jim that no matter where he went, he always wanted to be his flight chief. They had developed a special bond. One day, Jimmy and his chief of personnel, Jack Allard, flew to an airfield to meet a commander. Just after landing, the field came under attack, and they had to make a mad dash through an exploding ammunition dump. Jim returned to his plane to find it half covered in dirt and debris. Nearby, a group of men stood around a large bomb crater. Jim picked up the remains of a hand with a watch still on the wrist. The inscription read, "To Paul, with love." Paul Leonard had stayed in the plane long enough to shoot down a German fighter, then taken cover in a nearby ditch. The Germans had tried to bomb Doolittle's plane, but missed hitting the ditch instead. Jimmy turned on his heels and climbed into the dirt-covered plane, Jack Allard close behind. After blowing the dirt off with the prop wash, he roared down the runway. It was not the right thing to do, nor the smart thing to do. The plane should have been inspected first. Paul Leonard had done the smart thing by taking cover in the ditch. It didn't work out very well. The men on the field watched in stunned silence, most expecting the plane to cartwheel into a ball of flame. Jim nursed it into the air and then put it through a series of stiff maneuvers. He finally grunted to a petrified but respectful Jack Allard, "Well, I guess the damn thing will fly." When Jimmy commanded the 15th Air Force, He had the job of bombing Rome, the same Rome that had churches, shrines, and the Vatican. The rules of American warfare said you don't bomb the other side's religious sites, especially when their religion is the same as yours. The last plane on a bombing mission was called Tail End Charlie. It rarely made it through without taking a hit because the ground gunners had time to adjust their aim. Over Rome, Jimmy flew the Tail End Charlie spot himself because he wanted to make sure none of the churches were hit. And he wasn't even a churchgoer. After victory in North Africa, Doolittle was given command of the mighty 8th Air Force in Europe. His major enemy in England was the weather. 2 out of 3 days were unflyable. On his first airstrike, the weather turned bad shortly after launch. If the men had to return in those conditions, it could mean the loss of half of them. A recall would mean his first 8th Air Force mission was a failure. The lives of 6,000 flying personnel risked for nothing, and 1.5 million gallons of gasoline wasted. Jim watched and waited, then gave the order, recall. In 30 minutes, the weather changed, and the men returned to clear skies. A week later, the exact same thing happened. By now, most of the men in the 8th thought Doolittle had lost it, as did General Spots, the overall commander. Spots called him in and told him flat out, "Looks like you don't have the guts to run a big air force." Spots decided to tour Doolittle's air bases before making a decision about replacing him. As they flew from base to base, the weather was beautiful, but on the way back, it changed quickly, and they found themselves in dense fog extending all the way to the ground. Jim was forced to make a blind landing. They bounced and skidded to a halt, just feet from a stone wall that would have destroyed the plane and killed the 2 highest-ranking generals in England. The badly shaken Spots told Jimmy he was absolutely right in recalling those missions. Jimmy Doolittle became the first Air Force commander in history to conduct a large-scale attack without a single loss over 6,000 men, flying 800 bombers and 500 fighter planes. But running a big air force wasn't always about launching missions. One day, 2 women, a mother and her daughter, came to his office. They said they'd befriended one of his airmen, even loaning him their bicycle. Now he'd been transferred back to the States, and they were both pregnant. Jimmy assured them it was a very serious matter, and he'd have the airman brought back to deal with it. The women replied, "Oh no, we don't want to get him in trouble. We just want our bicycle back." One of the hardest decisions Jimmy made was to unleash the fighter planes to seek and destroy enemy aircraft, rather than escort bombers exclusively. The primary function of the fighters had always been to protect the bombers. The crews called them their little buddies. Doolittle felt that fighter planes were meant to be offensive weapons. The longer the Germans had planes in the air, the longer the war would last. Did it cost the lives of more bomber crews? Yes, but the real question was whether it saved more lives than it cost. Military historians, both German and American, estimate that Doolittle's handling of the 8th Air Force shortened the war by as much as a year. On June 6, 1944, Operation Overlord was launched, the code name for the Normandy invasion. 156,000 Allied troops from the United States, Britain, and Canada stormed ashore the beaches of Normandy. One of the greatest fears over the landing beaches was enemy planes. There was nowhere to run and nowhere to hide. But the 8th Air Force had so thoroughly bombed fuel dumps, ammunition depots, and airfields that the Germans couldn't get a single plane in the air. When reports from the beaches were slow in coming and mostly inaccurate, Jimmy climbed into a P-38 Lightning and, with a wingman, headed for the landing beaches to see for himself. He spotted a hole in the clouds, zipped through it, and returned to give General Eisenhower the first eyewitness account of the invasion. Eisenhower was grateful for the information but horrified at the thought of one of his top generals buzzing beaches in a fighter plane. He reminded Jim that he could easily have been shot down by his own troops, and that he needed a commander of the 8th Air Force more than a hotshot pilot. Jim told him the reason he took a P-38 was because it was the most recognizable plane in the service. He didn't want to get shot down either. He also spoke of seeing landing craft, taking direct hits and bodies flying through the air. It was surreal. In the last days of the European War, Jimmy put together the biggest air mission in history, 3,008 planes in one armada. Consider this. When Doolittle first joined the service, there were 55 airplanes in the entire United States. That effort literally brought the German war machine to a halt. When the war in Europe was over, Jim was sent to Okinawa in the Pacific to join General Douglas MacArthur. MacArthur was well known for his outspoken opinions and enormous ego. Jim was still carrying the label of a hotshot pilot, and he was determined to keep a low profile and let MacArthur have the glory. All Doolittle wanted was for the war to be over, but any long-range plans came to an abrupt halt on August 6, 1945. What had started nearly 4 years earlier with hundreds of bombs, bullets, and airplanes ended with just one bomb equaling 20,000 tons of TNT. 3 days later, a second bomb fell on Nagasaki, an exclamation point. After the war, Jimmy became a vice president at Shell Oil and later a director. His scientific background proved invaluable in the advancement of space-age fuels. In 1951, he was appointed special assistant to the Chief of the Air Force as a civilian in scientific matters, helping to bridge aerospace and ballistic missile development. In 1954, President Eisenhower asked Doolittle to conduct a study on the Central Intelligence Agency, which would become known as the Doolittle Report. The CIA had been formed just a few years earlier as primarily an information-gathering agency. But as the threat of communism grew around the world, so did the duties of the CIA. Jim felt the game plan needed changing. To combat the threat of communism, the act of fair play had to be re-examined. America was in a different kind of war now, and had to adjust to a different kind of warfare. The report was controversial, voicing opinions not normally associated with a democratic society. Jim's 2 sons followed in their father's footsteps and became flyers. Jim Jr. served in the Pacific in a medium bomber squadron and also as a bomber pilot with the 9th Air Force, where he was awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross. He served in Korea as a fighter pilot and later as a test pilot at Edwards Air Force Base. John Doolittle attended West Point, was a veteran of the Korean War, and served as a bomber pilot in Vietnam. In 1958, tragedy struck the Doolittle family. Jim Jr. committed suicide. There was no note. There was never an explanation. It's the kind of loss that leaves a parent asking unanswered questions for the rest of their life. Because of his military record and scientific background, Jimmy became chairman of the Air Force Scientific Board. He had the rare ability to bring both sides, scientists and warriors, together. From 1955 to 1965, he was a member of the President's Advisory Board on Foreign Intelligence. He was offered the job of heading up the National Aeronautics and Space Administration, NASA. He declined. That wasn't the only distinction Jim turned down. The city of Los Angeles wanted to name LAX after him. He declined that offer too, saying that most airports were named after deceased people, and he wasn't quite ready to make that sacrifice yet. In 1985, Congress promoted James Harold Doolittle to the rank of full General 4 stars. President Ronald Reagan and Senator Barry Goldwater had the honor of pinning those stars on his shoulders. In North Africa, in 1943, it had been decided to establish a yearly reunion for the Doolittle Raiders. The first official reunion was held in Miami, Florida, in 1945. The citizens of Tucson, Arizona had presented Doolittle with 80 silver goblets in a display case, one for each raider on the mission, which he in turn gave to the Air Force Academy for safekeeping. Each year, the raiders toasted the men who died on the raid and members who had passed away during the year. The deceased men's goblets were turned upside down in the display case. Their names had been inscribed on the goblets twice, right side up and upside down, so they could always be read. In 1993, Jim Doolittle's silver goblet was turned over. He passed away on September 27th at Pebble Beach, California. He was 96 years old. He was buried at Arlington National Cemetery, next to his wife, Jo. Among the awards and medals America bestowed on Jimmy Doolittle, the Horatio Alger Award, the Presidential Medal of Freedom, 2 Air Medals, 2 Distinguished Service Medals, 3 Distinguished Flying Crosses, the Bronze Star, the Silver Star, and the Medal of Honor. The countries of Great Britain, France, China, Bolivia, Belgium, Poland, and Ecuador all decorated Jimmy Doolittle with their highest awards. One of Jim's simplest philosophies, after all the speeches, words of wisdom, and advice he gave throughout his life, was this: lead by example, not by words. He is the only person in the history of the United States to be awarded both its highest military honor, the Medal of Honor, and its highest civilian honor, the Medal of Freedom. Now that's leading by example.